The sky over Ko had never turned that color before. Issei Hyoudou remembered that much clearly, the exact shade, somewhere between a bruise and a struck match, spreading across the horizon while the raiding game against the rogue Katara faction was still supposed to be a simple training exercise. Rias had called it a formality. Surzex had approved it as a formality. Nothing about the storm that tore open the sky and swallowed the entire battlefield had felt like a formality. He remembered Rias shouting his name. He remembered Akino's lightning scattering uselessly against the wind that bent the wrong way, curling in on itself like it belonged to a world with different rules. He remembered reaching for Asia's hand and missing it by inches before the light took him apart, and put him back together somewhere else entirely. Now there was sand under his palms, warm and pale, and the roar of surf instead of thunder, and a sun directly overhead that gave no hint of what country he might be looking up into, if he was even still in a country at all. Issei sat up slowly, checking himself for the damage his body insisted it should have taken. Nothing. Not a scratch, not a bruise, not even the ringing in his ears he expected after being thrown through whatever that storm had been. His tracksuit was dry. His breathing was steady. Only his heart refused to settle, hammering against his ribs as he turned in a slow circle and found nothing but a curve of white beach, a wall of green jungle behind it, and no sign of Rias, Akino, Asia, Kiba, Kaneko, Gasper, Zenobia, or Irina anywhere in sight. He tried Drake first. Hey! You there? The boosted gear stayed silent longer than he liked before the familiar voice finally rumbled to life, quieter than usual, almost cautious. I am here, partner. Though I will admit I do not recognize where here is. That was not the reassurance Issei had been hoping for. He got to his feet, brushed the sand from his knees, and made himself think the way Rias had trained him to think when things went wrong, which was to say, calmly, and one problem at a time. First problem, he was alone. Second problem, he had no idea what direction anything was in. Third problem, and this one made his stomach drop the moment he tested it, when he reached for the familiar hum of his devil energy, of boosted gear readiness, of the bond that always let him sense Rias's general direction when they were apart, he found the connection thin and static, like a phone call with most of the bars gone. Something here is dampening us, Drake said before Issei could ask. Not blocking. Muffling. I have never felt anything quite like it. Great, Issei muttered. Awesome. Love that for us. He picked a direction, mostly because the jungle looked slightly less dense that way, and started walking. The heat pressed down heavier once he left the open beach, thick with the smell of wet leaves and something sweeter underneath, almost like flowers he didn't recognize. Birds he didn't recognize either called out somewhere above the canopy, and twice he thought he saw movement at the corner of his vision that turned out to be nothing when he spun to look. It was the third time he caught that flicker of motion that he finally heard the voice. Is someone there? Please, if that's you, Issei, please say something. He would have known that voice underwater, in a hurricane, from the far side of the planet. Asia! He broke into a run toward the sound and found her a moment later, kneeling beside a fallen log with her hands pressed together like she'd been praying, or trying to, her green eyes going wide and wet with relief the second she saw him crash through the tree line. She was on her feet and across the clearing before he could say another word, throwing her arms around him hard enough that he nearly stumbled backward. I woke up alone, she said into his shoulder, voice shaking. I thought maybe I was the only one who came through. You're not alone. I'm here. We're gonna find the others too, okay? I promise. He said it with more confidence than he felt, but the moment the words left his mouth he decided he meant them anyway. That was usually how it worked with him. Say the brave thing first, grow into it after. Asia pulled back just enough to look at him, wiping at her eyes with the back of her wrist. Do you have any idea where we are? None. Zero. My connection to everyone feels like it's underwater. He glanced around the clearing, taking in details he'd missed while running, the strange pale flowers growing in careful clusters along the log, the way the jungle floor here looked almost tended, like something had cleared the underbrush on purpose rather than nature doing it by accident. But we're not gonna just sit around waiting for something to happen. Let's find higher ground. See if we can spot smoke, or the ocean, or literally anything useful. Asia nodded, and for the first time since he'd found her, something like resolve steadied her expression. She reached out and took his hand, not out of fear this time but simply so they wouldn't lose each other again, and together they picked a direction that seemed to climb and started walking. They hadn't gone 20 feet before the underbrush to their left rustled sharply, and Issei's whole body went rigid, stepping in front of Asia on pure reflex, fists already coming up. A small shape dropped down out of the low branches, landing in a crouch with the kind of effortless balance that only one person Issei knew actually had. "Took you too long enough," Kaneko said, straightening up and brushing a leaf out of her white hair like she hadn't just startled 10 years off his life. "I've been circling for an hour." Issei let out a breath that was half relief, half exasperation. "A little warning next time would be nice. You'd have heard me if you were paying attention." She looked between the two of them, her golden eyes flicking briefly toward their joined hands before returning to Issei's face, unreadable as always. "I found something. A structure. Old. You should see it." "Ruins?" Asia asked. "Ruins," Kaneko confirmed. "And there's writing on them I can't read. Might be important. Might tell us where we are." Issei looked at Asia, and Asia looked back at him, and neither of them needed to say anything before they fell into step behind Kaneko, heading deeper into a jungle that, the longer they walked, felt less and less like it belonged to any world Issei recognized. The ruins turned out to be larger than Issei expected, a half-collapsed archway of pale stone swallowed almost entirely by vines, standing at the center of a clearing where the jungle seemed to have deliberately grown around rather than over it. Faded carvings ran along both sides of the arch, worn smooth by time but still visible if he squinted, depicting shapes that might have been women, might have been something else, arranged in a circle around a symbol he didn't recognize at all, a closed eye ring by 7 smaller marks. "Any of that mean anything to you?" he asked Drake quietly. "Nothing I have encountered in my long memory," Drake admitted. "Which, partner, concerns me more than if I recognized it as something dangerous. I know what dangerous looks like. This is simply old." Kaneko crouched at the base of the arch, running her fingers lightly over one of the carved women. "There's magic in the stone. Faint. Like it's been asleep a long time." "Asleep is good," Issei said. "Asleep is better than awake. Depends what wakes it up." Asia had drifted a few steps away, drawn by a cluster of the same pale flowers Issei had noticed earlier, growing thick around the base of the ruin like they'd been planted there on purpose rather than sprouting wild. She knelt and touched one gently, and it seemed to lean toward her fingers, the way a plant might lean toward sunlight. "These are beautiful," she said. "I've never seen anything like them. They almost feel warm." "Everything about this place is warm," Issei muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. "I'd kill for some shade that actually blocks the sun." As if summoned by the complaint, the light overhead shifted, the sun sliding behind a bank of clouds that had rolled in with unusual speed, and the temperature dropped just enough to be noticeable. Issei froze, glancing at Kaneko, who had also gone still, her ears twitching beneath her hair. "That felt like a response," she said. "To what?" "Me complaining about the heat." "To something," she said, which was not reassuring in the slightest. They made camp near the ruin rather than press on, mostly because the light was already beginning to fail and none of them wanted to be caught wandering an unfamiliar jungle after dark. Issei gathered wood while Kaneko scouted a loose perimeter and Asia worked at coaxing a small fire to life with more patience than Issei ever managed on his own. By the time full dark fell, they had a modest blaze crackling between them, and Issei found himself staring up through the gap in the canopy at a sky absolutely thick with stars, more stars than he'd ever seen from Ko, arranged in patterns he didn't recognize at all. "Not our sky," Kaneko said, following his gaze. "Yeah. Figured that much out myself. I mean it might not even be our world." That settled over the fire like a weight. Asia's hand stilled where she'd been feeding a small branch into the flames, and Issei felt the same cold drop in his stomach he'd been fighting off since he first opened his eyes on the beach. "The others are out there somewhere," he said, mostly to fill the silence, mostly to remind himself. "Bucho's strong. Akino's strong. Zenobia could probably punch her way through half this island if she had to. They're fine. We just have to find them." Or they find us, Kaneko said. Whoever gets to the middle of the island first is probably going to find everyone else, if that arch is any indication. Things like this tend to be built where paths cross. Asia looked up, firelight catching the worry still lingering in her eyes, though there was something steadier underneath it now, something that had been building since the moment she'd found Issei on the beach. Then we should keep moving toward the center tomorrow. Together. Together, Issei agreed, and reached out to squeeze her hand once, briefly, before letting the fire burn low enough that the strange stars overhead became the brightest thing in the clearing. None of them slept easily. Issei kept one eye cracked toward the treeline for most of the night, half convinced he heard footsteps that never quite resolved into anything, half convinced the pale flowers around the ruin were glowing faintly in a way they hadn't been at sunset. He didn't mention it to the others. There would be time to worry about strange flowers once he'd found the rest of his family. When dawn finally broke, pale and gold through the canopy, Kaneko was already awake and standing at the treeline, utterly still, her head tilted like she was listening to something none of the rest of them could hear. Smoke, she said, before Issei even managed to sit up properly. East. Thin, but it's there. Issei was on his feet in an instant, all the stiffness of a rough night's sleep forgotten. Could be them. Could be a lot of things, Kaneko said, but she was already moving, and neither Issei nor Asia hesitated to follow her toward whatever waited at the source of that thin gray line rising into the morning sky. The smoke belonged to Rias. Issei broke into a dead run the moment he spotted red hair through the trees, and the sound he made when Rias turned and saw him was embarrassing enough that he'd have been mortified about it under any other circumstances. As it was, he didn't care in the slightest, closing the distance and pulling her into a hug that she returned just as fiercely, her fingers curling into the back of his shirt like she needed the physical proof he was really there. "You absolute idiot," she said into his shoulder, voice tight. "Running off into unknown jungle without so much as a plan. I found Asia and Kaneko within an hour, so clearly my plan worked out fine. Your plan was luck. My plan is usually luck. It's kind of my whole thing." She pulled back to look at him properly, relief and exasperation warring across her face in equal measure, before her gaze shifted past him to Asia and Kaneko, and some of the tension in her shoulders finally eased. "3 of you together? Good. That's good." Beyond her, Issei spotted the rest of the camp Rias had clearly been organizing since dawn. Akino crouched near a second, larger fire, feeding it steadily while keeping half her attention on the treeline. Zenobia stood a short distance off with her arms crossed, scanning the jungle with the focused intensity of someone expecting trouble to walk out of it at any moment, Duran now resting against a nearby rock within easy reach. And Irina sat cross-legged near the fire's edge, murmuring something under her breath that Issei recognized, after a second, as a prayer. "I see." Akino's voice carried across the clearing, warm and teasing despite everything. "I was starting to worry you'd gotten yourself eaten by something exotic." "Rude," Issei called back, though he was smiling. Zenobia crossed the distance in a few long strides and clapped a hand on his shoulder hard enough to rock him slightly. "Good. You're alive. I was prepared to search the entire island if necessary. Appreciate the confidence." Irina abandoned her prayer to throw herself at him next, hugging him with the same enthusiastic force she did everything else. "I prayed the whole time we'd find each other. I think it's working. Michael's probably watching over us even here." "Let's hope so," Issei said, though privately he doubted any angel's sight reached wherever they'd landed. He looked around the camp again, doing a head count that kept coming up too short. Kiba and Gasper. "Any sign?" Rias's expression sobered. "None yet. We've been scouting in shifts since sunrise, staying close to camp so we don't scatter further, but we haven't found them." "We'll find them," Issei said immediately, the same promise he made Asia the day before, and this time he felt the whole camp lean slightly toward believing it with him. Akino waved him closer to the fire, where a modest collection of fruits sat gathered on a broad leaf, gathered from trees none of them recognized but that Zenobia had apparently tested cautiously enough to declare safe. "Eat something first. Then we plan." They ate in relative quiet, the kind of quiet that came from everyone privately turning the same problem over in their heads. It was Rias who finally spoke first, once the last of the fruit was gone and the fire had settled into steady embers. None of our magic is working the way it should, she said. I tried summoning a magic circle back to the underworld the moment I woke up. Nothing. Not even a flicker. Akinos tried contacting Sona through our usual channel. Same result. Dampened, Issei said. Drake said the same thing. Dampened, or deliberately sealed, Zenobia said. Which suggests this isn't an accident. Someone, or something, built a barrier around this place strong enough to cut off devils, angels, and whatever exactly Kaneko counts as, all at once. Nikomata, Kaneko said flatly. And thanks for that. My point stands. Rias nodded slowly, working through it the way she worked through every problem, methodically, refusing to let fear outrun logic. There's an arch Kaneko found it yesterday, carved with symbols none of us recognize. It felt old. Deliberate. If something built that arch, and something built the barrier keeping us here, they might be connected. There's your center of the island, Kaneko said quietly. Told you. So that's the plan, Rias said, looking around the circle at each of them in turn, landing last on Issei, something steady and determined passing between them without either of them needing to say it aloud. We move as one group from here on. We find Kiba and Gasper. And we get to the heart of whatever this place is, because I refuse to believe there isn't a way home once we understand what we're dealing with. Nobody argued. Nobody even hesitated. They broke camp within the hour, following the same rough direction that had led Issei, Asia, and Kaneko to the ruin the day before, 7 of them moving together through jungle that seemed, the deeper they went, to grow steadily older, the trees taller and stranger, more of those pale flowers scattered across the forest floor like something had been cultivating them for centuries. It was Irina who spotted the second arch first, twin to the one Kaneko had found, standing at the edge of a wide clearing that opened onto what could only be described as a ruined courtyard, vast and half swallowed by vines. Dozens of the carved women repeated along broken columns that stretched further than Issei could easily count, and standing motionless at the center of it, silhouetted against the pale stone, was a small figure with unmistakable golden eyes and a shock of dark hair, staring up at something none of them could yet see. Gasper! Issei's shout echoed off the broken columns before he even fully registered moving, and the small vampire spun around so fast he nearly tripped over his own feet, relief crumpling his face the second he recognized the voices closing in around him. I thought I was alone forever, Gasper said, his voice wobbling dangerously close to tears as Issei reached him first and pulled him into a rough, one-armed hug. I'd been here since yesterday. I didn't know what to do. I just stayed near the big statue because it felt safer than the jungle. You did good, Issei said, and meant it. You're safe now. That's what matters. Rias arrived a beat behind him, cupping Gasper's face briefly to check him over for injury before pulling him into her own embrace. And one by one the rest of the group closed the distance, until the little courtyard that had held only Gasper's fear a moment earlier was suddenly full of familiar voices and relieved laughter. Kiba was the last piece missing, and the thought of it kept a knot in Issei's chest even as everyone settled, kept scanning the treeline out of habit whenever conversation lulled. It was Gasper, in fact, who solved that particular worry, once he'd calmed down enough to speak in full sentences. There was someone else here. Earlier. A boy with blonde hair, he called out to me, but the ground kind of opened up between us, like the whole courtyard shifted. I couldn't reach him. I'm sorry, I should have tried harder. That's not your fault, Rias said firmly. None of this is anyone's fault. If the ground shifted, that tells us something important. This place isn't just old and sealed. It's active. It responds to something. Responds to what, though? Zenobia said, studying the vast statue at the center of the courtyard, a towering figure of the same pale stone as the arches, depicting a robed woman with her eyes closed and both hands cupped before her, as though holding something invisible. Around the base of the statue, 7 smaller alcoves had been carved into a wide ring, each one empty, each one shaped unmistakably like it was meant to hold something roughly person-sized. Akino crouched near the nearest alcove, tracing the edge of it with careful fingers. These look less like decoration and more like they were built to be filled. Filled with what? Asia asked quietly. Nobody had an answer, and the silence that followed was heavier for it, until Kaniko's ears flattened suddenly, and she turned sharply toward the statue itself, every line of her body going tense. "It's warm," she said. "The stone. It wasn't warm a second ago." Issei felt it too, a change in the air pressure around the courtyard, subtle but unmistakable, the same electric stillness that came right before Akino summoned lightning, except this time it wasn't coming from any of them. The great statue's closed stone eyes did not open, exactly, but light bloomed behind the carved lids anyway, soft and gold, spilling out in thin lines along every seam of the ancient sculpture. A voice followed the light, resonant and layered, neither male nor female, filling the courtyard from every direction at once without ever seeming to come from anywhere specific. 7 have arrived. 1 remains beyond the veil, drawn but not yet delivered. Rest, children of scattered houses. The island does not wish you harm. The island wishes only to be understood. Issei's hand had gone instinctively to the boosted gear, though for once he didn't summon it, some instinct telling him that whatever this was, it hadn't announced itself as an enemy. Rhea stepped slightly in front of the group anyway, her chin lifted, every inch the heiress facing down an unknown power. "Who are you?" she said, voice clear and steady despite the tension humming beneath it. "And what do you want with us?" The golden light pulsed once, gently, almost like a breath. "I have been called many names by many guests, across more centuries than your kind counts easily. You may call me the Warden, for that is closest to what I have become. As for what I want, that answer will unfold slowly, and I ask only that you allow it to. You are not prisoners. You are not offerings. You are, for now, simply guests who arrived before they were ready, and the island will not release what it has not finished understanding." "That's not an answer," Zenobia said bluntly. "That's a riddle." A sound rippled through the golden light that might, impossibly, have been amusement. "Fair. Then here is something plainer. Your friend beyond the veil will be delivered to you within a day's turning, once the barrier finishes its work upon him, as it has already finished with each of you. Use the time to rest, to gather yourselves, and to trust one another, for trust is the first thing this place will ask you to prove. The eyes of the 7 alcoves will not stay empty forever. What fills them depends entirely on what you choose to become while you remain here." The light dimmed as gradually as it had risen, fading back into ordinary stone until the statue looked, once again, like nothing more than an ancient and beautiful ruin, its secrets folded back beneath closed eyes. For a long moment, nobody spoke. "Well," Akino said eventually, breaking the silence with the particular lightness she used whenever things had gotten too heavy to bear directly, that was ominous and vague in roughly equal measure. "My favorite combination. Kiba's coming back to us," Issei said, latching onto the one piece of that speech that mattered most to him in the moment. "Tomorrow. That's something. That's good." "It is," Rias agreed, though the furrow between her brows hadn't eased at all. "But I don't like being told we're being tested without being told what the test is." "Get in line," Kaniko muttered. Asia, quiet through most of the exchange, moved closer to the statue's base, studying the 7 empty alcoves with an expression Issei couldn't quite read, something thoughtful and a little sad. "Whoever came here before us," she said softly, "I wonder what happened to them." Nobody answered that either, and Issei found himself hoping, quietly, that it was a question they wouldn't have to learn the answer to the hard way. They made proper camp in the shelter of the ruined courtyard that night, close enough to the great statue to feel some vague, unspoken safety in its presence, though nobody said as much out loud. Zenobia and Kaniko took the first watch between them, trading low, clipped conversation about defensible positions and likely threats, while Akino worked her way methodically through what supplies they'd managed to gather, more of the pale flowers, a handful of fruit, water collected in wide leaves from a stream Rias had found earlier that afternoon. Issei ended up seated near the fire beside Asia, who had spent the better part of an hour carefully weaving a handful of those same pale flowers into a loose braid, more out of nervous habit than any real purpose, until she held it up and considered it with a small, surprised smile. "They don't wilt," she said. "I picked these hours ago. Look, still fresh." "Everything about this place is a little too fresh," Issei said, though he leaned over to look anyway, and found she was right, the pale petals still soft and full, not a hint of the wilting he'd have expected from any ordinary flower plucked that morning. Do you think that voice was telling the truth? Asia asked, quieter now. About Kiba. About us not being prisoners. I think, Issei said slowly, working it out as he spoke, that whatever it is, it didn't have to talk to us at all. It could have just kept us in the dark and let us panic. Instead, it gave us something to hold on to. That's gotta count for something. Or it wants us calm for a reason, Asia said, and Issei blinked at her, a little surprised by the sharpness of the thought coming from someone usually so gentle. When did you get so suspicious? I've been traveling with you in Bucho for a long time now, she said, and there was real warmth under the words even as her tone stayed serious. I've learned that things which sound kind aren't always simple. He couldn't really argue with that, so instead he bumped his shoulder gently against hers, and after a moment she leaned into it, resting her head against him with the flower braid still loosely held between her fingers, and for a little while neither of them said anything else, content just to sit together in the firelight, while the strange stars wheeled slowly overhead. Across the fire, Rias watched the two of them with an expression that flickered briefly between fondness and something more complicated, something she didn't examine too closely, before Aquino settled in beside her with a cup of gathered water and a knowing look that needed no words to land its point. You're staring, Rias, Aquino said, voice pitched low enough not to carry. I'm keeping watch. You're keeping watch on Issei and Asia specifically, which is a very particular kind of watch. Rias huffed, but didn't deny it, taking the offered cup instead and drinking to buy herself a moment before answering. We are stranded in an unknown world, cut off from every resource we've ever relied on, being tested by some ancient guardian for reasons it refuses to fully explain, and my peerage is handling it by falling asleep in pairs by the fire like this is a school camping trip. Would you rather we panicked instead? No, Rias admitted softer. No, I suppose I wouldn't. Then let them have this, Aquino said, tipping her head toward Issei and Asia without quite pointing. Whatever's coming tomorrow, whatever this island wants from us, I think we'll face it better as a family that still remembers how to be gentle with each other, rather than one that's forgotten how in the name of readiness. Rias didn't answer that directly, but some of the tension eased out of her shoulders anyway, and she let her gaze drift, eventually, from Issei and Asia to Zenovia's steady silhouette at the tree-lean, to Kaneko curled in a watchful crouch nearby, to Irina still murmuring soft prayers under her breath even in her sleep, to Gasper finally resting easy for the first time since he'd been found, tucked against Aquino's other side. 7 of them, gathered safe for one night at least, with an 8th on his way back to them by morning. It wasn't home. It wasn't anything close to home. But looking around the fire at the family she'd built out of misfits and survivors and second chances, Rias found she could, for the moment, allow herself to hope that whatever the island wanted from them, they would meet it exactly the way Aquino had said. Together, and without losing what made them worth saving in the first place. The fire burned low. The strange stars turned overhead in patterns none of them recognized. And far across the island, beyond a veil none of them could yet see through, something in the dark finally began to stir, drawing the lost blonde knight one slow step closer to the family waiting for him. Kiba came back to them a little after sunrise, exactly as the warden had promised, stepping out from between 2 ancient columns as though he'd simply been delayed on a walk rather than lost somewhere beyond a magical veil for an entire night. He looked unharmed, if a little dazed, blinking against the morning light with the particular expression of someone who wasn't yet sure whether what he'd experienced had been real. There was a moment, he said, once the others had finished crowding around him, once Gasper had stopped clinging to his sleeve and Rias had finished checking him over for injuries that weren't there, where I could hear all of you. Faintly. Like a room away. And then the ground just opened, and here I am. Did you see anything? Zenovia asked. Anything that might explain what this place actually is? Kiba shook his head slowly. Only darkness, and then light, and then your faces. I'm sorry I can't be more useful than that. You're here, Issei said, clapping him on the shoulder. That's useful enough for one morning. With the full peerage gathered for the first time since the storm, the mood around the ruined courtyard shifted into something almost lighter, 8 of them sharing what food they'd gathered, trading the fragmented stories of their first day apart, laughing more than any of them probably should have given the circumstances, if only because laughing together was easier than sitting with how strange and uncertain everything still was. It didn't last. The great statue's stone eyes bled gold light again just as Akino was teasing Kiba about the state of his hair, and every conversation in the courtyard died at once, all 8 of them turning toward the warden as the layered voice rolled out across the ruins once more. 8 now gathered, whole and unbroken. This pleases me more than you may realize. Few groups arrive complete within a single turning of the sun. Few groups, Rias repeated, stepping forward with her chin lifted the way she always did when she meant to be taken seriously. You keep implying we aren't the first. Who else has been here? The golden light pulsed, slow and thoughtful, before answering. Many, across a great span of years, though time moves strangely within this place, and I do not always count it as your kind would. Some left whole. Some left changed. Some remained still, woven into the island itself, having never finished what was asked of them. A chill went through the courtyard that had nothing to do with the morning air. Issei glanced instinctively at the 7 empty alcoves ringing the statue's base, and found he wasn't the only one doing so, Asia's hand finding his without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other. That's not an answer that makes me want to trust you, Issei said. I do not ask for blind trust, the warden replied, and something in its tone, if it could be called that, seemed almost gentle. I ask only that you attempt what is set before you honestly, and judge me by how fairly I keep my word once you have. The first trial awaits beyond the courtyard, through the path that will open at midday. It asks nothing more complicated than this. Trust one another enough to walk blind. Walk blind, Kaneko repeated flatly. Great. Love that. You will understand when you arrive, the warden said, and the light dimmed once more, leaving the statue silent and still, though this time the silence felt less like absence and more like something patiently waiting. Rias turned to face her peerage, and whatever uncertainty had flickered across her expression during the exchange smoothed itself back into the steady calm they all relied on from her. We have until midday. Let's use it well. Eat properly, check each other over, and if anyone needs to talk through what happened yesterday, now is the time, not in the middle of whatever this trial turns out to be. They scattered loosely around the courtyard to do exactly that, Akino and Irina comparing notes on the strange stillness of the island's magic, Zenobia sharpening a blade that hadn't actually dulled at all, more out of habit than necessity, Kaneko curled in a patch of sun with her eyes half closed but her ears still tracking every sound around her. Issei found himself pulled aside by Kiba, who steered him a short distance from the others with the particular seriousness he only used when something was actually bothering him. Can I ask you something, Kiba said, and have you actually answer honestly instead of joking your way out of it? Depends on the question. When I was on the other side of that veil, alone, the thing I kept thinking about wasn't getting back to the underworld. It wasn't finishing my old business with Excalibur or any of that. It was getting back to this exact group of people. Kiba glanced toward the others, toward Rias laughing at something Akino said, toward Asia carefully braiding more of the pale flowers into Gasper's hair while he squirmed and protested without much real conviction. I don't know what this island wants from us. But I think whatever it is, it already has more leverage over us than it realizes, because we do almost anything to keep this family together. Issei considered that for a long moment, watching the same scene Kiba was watching, and found he couldn't disagree with a single word of it. Yeah, he said finally. Yeah, I think you're right. So let's just make sure that leverage works for us instead of against us. Kiba managed a small smile at that. That's surprisingly wise for you. I have my moments. By the time the sun climbed toward its highest point, a path had indeed opened at the far edge of the courtyard, a narrow avenue between the columns that hadn't been visible that morning, lined on either side with more of the pale flowers, glowing now with a faint inner light that pulsed slowly like a heartbeat. Rias led them toward it without hesitation, and one by one, the family that had survived a dimensional storm together stepped onto a path none of them could see the end of, trusting, for lack of any better option, that walking forward together was still the right choice. The path narrowed as they walked, the glowing flowers giving way eventually to smooth stone corridors that seemed to have been carved directly into a hillside, lit by no visible source and yet never quite dark. It ended in a wide chamber, circular, its walls lined with the same 7 carved alcoves as the courtyard above, though these were smaller, closer together, and at the center of the room stood 7 strips of dark cloth laid out on a low stone table, each one long enough to serve as a blindfold. Of course, Zenobia said, eyeing the cloth with open suspicion. Walk blind. Very literal. The warden's voice followed them into the chamber a moment later, filling the space the same way it had filled the courtyard, though quieter here, more intimate. The trial is simple in its shape and difficult in its execution. Each of you will be blindfolded and led through this chamber by voice alone, guided by a partner who cannot touch you, who can only speak. The path is narrow, and mistakes here carry consequence, though none that will harm you permanently. What I ask is only this. Trust the voice guiding you completely, and speak truthfully to the one you guide. Define consequence, Issei said warily. You will know it if you experience it, the warden said, which was, as usual, not remotely reassuring. Choose your pairs. There was a brief scramble of glances around the chamber, the kind of unspoken negotiation that happened whenever a group needed to sort itself quickly, and Issei found himself, without quite deciding it on purpose, paired with Rias, while Akino claimed Kiba, Zenobia paired off with Kaneko, and Asia ended up guiding Irina, with Gasper hovering nervously near Rias and Issei until Akino gently pulled him toward her own pair instead, promising to watch over him through the trial as a trio. You go first, Rias said to Issei, tying the blindfold around his eyes herself, her fingers steady and sure even as her voice carried a thread of something more careful underneath the usual command. I'll guide you. And then we switch. Darkness closed in immediately, disorienting in a way Issei hadn't expected, the chamber's soft light vanishing entirely, leaving only the sound of his own breathing and the distant murmur of the others preparing around him. Ready? Rias's voice, close, steady. Ready. 3 steps forward. Slowly. He obeyed, hyper-aware of every inch of ground under his sneakers, half expecting a drop or a wall or something worse with every step, but nothing came except Rias's voice, guiding him left, then right, then pausing him entirely while somewhere nearby he heard Kaneko mutter something short and irritated at Zenobia, followed by Zenobia's low laugh. There's a narrow point here, Rias said. The walls close on both sides. Turn your shoulders sideways and keep going. He did, feeling stone brush lightly against his shoulders on either side exactly as she'd warned, and something in him settled at how precisely her voice matched what his body found, no hesitation in her instructions at all. You're doing great, she added, quieter now, almost like she hadn't meant to say it out loud. I mean that. Careful, Bucho. Compliments during a blind trial. Feels like cheating. It's not cheating if it's true. He felt his face warm behind the blindfold and was grateful, for once, that she couldn't see it. The path continued, twisting through turns he never would have found on his own, Rias's voice never wavering, never hesitating even once, until finally she called a halt and told him he could remove the blindfold. He blinked against the dim chamber light and found they'd reached a small alcove set into the far wall, empty like all the others, though this one held a single carved symbol at its base, the same closed eye from the courtyard arch, except here the eye was open, rendered in careful detail, staring back at him. Guess I passed, he said. You trusted me completely, Rias said, studying the open stone eye with a thoughtful frown. Not one moment of hesitation. I could hear it in how you moved. Of course I trusted you. It's you. She looked at him then, something soft cutting through the usual composed authority she carried, and for a moment neither of them said anything else, until she cleared her throat and reached for the blindfold in his hands. My turn. Try to be half as good a guide as I was. No promises, he said, grinning, and tied the cloth carefully over her eyes. Guiding her turned out to be harder than being guided, every instruction feeling weighted with a responsibility he hadn't expected, the fear of leading her wrong sitting heavier in his chest than any fear he'd felt for himself. He talked her through every turn with more care than he'd ever used narrating anything, and when they reached her own empty alcove and the stone eye there blinked open exactly as his had, he felt an absurd swell of pride he hadn't been expecting. Around the chamber, the others finished their own paths in turn, Akino guiding Kiba with playful confidence that nonetheless never led him wrong, Kaneko and Zenobia moving through their sections with the clipped efficiency of 2 people who trusted each other's competence completely even if they rarely said so aloud, and Asia guiding Irina with a gentle, patient voice that had Irina in quiet tears by the time they reached the end. Moved less by the trial itself and more by how carefully Asia had looked after her the entire way. When all 7 alcoves in the lower chamber had opened their stone eyes, the warden's voice returned, warmer now than Issei had yet heard it. Trust proven. The first trial is complete. You have done in one turning what some groups fail across many. Rest here if you wish. The second trial will not open until you are ready, and I do not rush what deserves patience. The golden light faded, and the chamber settled into an easy quiet, 8 teenagers and 1 small vampire boy sitting scattered across the stone floor, blindfolds discarded, the tension of the morning finally beginning to unwind into something like relief. They didn't move on immediately. Nobody suggested it, and Rias, watching her peerage sprawled loosely around the chamber in the aftermath of the trial, decided against pushing them, choosing instead to let the quiet stretch while Aquino passed around what remained of their gathered fruit and Gasper fell asleep with his head in Kaniko's lap, utterly unbothered by everything that had happened around him that day. Issei ended up seated near one of the open stone alcoves, tracing the carved out with idle fingers, when Aquino settled beside him with the easy, deliberate closeness she always used, close enough that her shoulder brushed his. You looked very serious guiding Rias through that maze, she said, tone light but her dark eyes watching him carefully. More serious than I've ever seen you about anything that didn't involve dragons. Yeah, well, didn't want to mess it up. You wouldn't have, even if you had stumbled a little. That's rather the point of trust, isn't it? That it survives the occasional mistake. She tilted her head, considering him with the particular focus that always made him a little nervous, like she could see straight through whatever he was trying not to say. Would you guide me through something like that, I see? Blind, no room for error, nothing but my voice to hold on to? Obviously. Without hesitation? Aquino, I'd trust you with a lot more than a walk through a dark hallway. That earned him one of her real smiles, not the teasing one she wore for the group but something smaller and warmer, gone almost as quickly as it appeared, replaced by her usual playful composure. Careful. Say things like that and I might start believing you actually mean them. I do mean them. She studied him a beat longer, something flickering behind her eyes that she didn't quite let surface, before she bumped her shoulder lightly against his and let the moment pass with the same effortless grace she brought to everything else. Good. Hold on to that feeling. I have a suspicion this island isn't finished asking us to prove it. She wasn't wrong. It was nearly an hour later, once Gasper had woken from his nap and Rias had roused the group with gentle insistence, that a second corridor revealed itself at the chamber's far wall, sloping downward this time, cool air drifting up from somewhere below carrying the faint scent of water. Guess that's our cue, Issei said, and the group fell into step behind Rias once more, descending into a passage that wound deeper than any of them expected, the smooth stone walls giving way gradually to something rougher, more natural, until they emerged into a cavern vast enough that the ceiling disappeared entirely into darkness overhead. At the center of the cavern lay a still, black pool, perfectly circular, its surface so undisturbed it looked less like water and more like polished glass. 7 narrow stone paths radiated outward from its edge like spokes on a wheel, each one leading to a small platform, and standing at the center of the pool itself, and possibly, was a figure carved from the same pale stone as everything else on the island, kneeling with her head bowed and her hands folded, indistinguishable in style from the great statue above except for her smaller, more human scale. Another guardian? Rias asked, though she didn't seem to expect an answer from any of them. The warden's voice rose from the water itself this time, rippling the surface with each word. Not a guardian. A guest, as you are, who came before you and chose to remain rather than leave incomplete. Her name is not mine to give, only hers, and she is not able to give it herself any longer. I show her to you not to frighten you, but so that you understand plainly what failure here can cost, and why I do not take the trials lightly even when I speak of them gently. The chamber went very still. Issei felt Asia's hand find his again, gripping tighter than before, and even Zenobia, who rarely showed much outward reaction to anything, had gone pale studying the kneeling figure. She failed the trial, Kaniko said quietly. And this is what happened. She failed to trust, the warden corrected, gentle but unflinching. Not a single trial, but the deeper truth beneath all of them. She arrived with companions much like yours, and she chose, in the moment that mattered most, to save herself rather than believe her companions would do the same for her. The island does not punish fear. It punishes the choice fear leads to, when trust is offered and refused. Rias's jaw tightened, and when she spoke again, her voice carried the particular steel she reserved for moments that actually terrified her. Then let us be absolutely clear. None of us are leaving anyone behind here. Not for a trial, not for anything. I did not doubt it, the warden said, and something in its layered voice, impossibly, sounded almost pleased. The second trial lies across this water, at the platform directly opposite where you stand. It will ask each of you, one at a time, to face something drawn from your own fear, alone, while the others wait and are powerless to help until called. This is harder than trust in another. This is trust in yourself, that you will not become what she became. Nobody spoke for a long moment, all 8 of them staring across the still black water at the distant platform, at the kneeling stone figure between them and it, a silent, permanent reminder of exactly what the island was capable of extracting from those who came here unprepared. It was Asia, finally, who broke the silence, her voice small but steady. Then we go one at a time, and everyone else stays right here, watching, so whoever's facing it knows the rest of us haven't gone anywhere. That's exactly right, Rias said, some of the steel in her voice softening into something warmer, prouder. Nobody crosses that water believing they're alone. Even if we can't help directly, we'll make sure they know we're here. One by one, they turned to look at each other, silently working out an order, and it was Issei who finally stepped forward first, jaw set, boosted gear humming faintly at his wrist as though even Drake understood the weight of what came next. Might as well be me, he said. Let's see what this island thinks I'm afraid of. The path across the water held firm under Issei's feet, though it felt narrower than it looked, and he kept his eyes fixed on the far platform rather than the black glassy surface on either side, half convinced that looking down too long would show him something he didn't want to see. Behind him, he could hear the others gathered at the pool's edge, silent and watching, and he held on to that the whole way across, the simple fact of 8 people refusing to look away. The platform, when he reached it, was bare stone, empty except for a low archway standing alone with nothing behind it but darkness. He stepped through without letting himself hesitate, and the cavern vanished entirely, replaced in an instant by somewhere achingly familiar. Ko Academy's old-school building, empty, lit by the reddish light of a sunset that never seemed to move. He knew this place. He'd stood here before, in memories that weren't pleasant ones, and his stomach dropped even before he heard the footsteps behind him. He turned, and found Rias standing there, except her expression was wrong, cold in a way he'd never actually seen from her, arms crossed, looking at him like he was something disappointing rather than someone she cared about. You were always going to slow us down eventually, Illusion, Rias said, voice flat and clinical. A pawn who thinks he's worth 8 pieces. It was cute for a while. It's not anymore. That's not her, Issei said immediately, out loud, mostly to steady himself. That's not you. More figures appeared behind her, one by one, wearing familiar faces and wrong expressions, Akino's usual warmth replaced by cool indifference, Asia's gentle concern twisted into open disappointment, Kaneko simply turning her back on him entirely. Each one of them delivered some version of the same cutting judgment, that he was excess weight, that his usefulness had run out, that the family he'd built his entire sense of worth around had quietly decided they'd be better off without him. It would have worked, maybe, on some earlier version of himself, the version who'd spent his first months as a devil desperately proving he deserved a place at Rias's side at all. But Issei had spent a long time since then learning exactly what he was worth, not through anyone else's approval, but through choosing, over and over, to show up for the people he loved regardless of what it cost him. You're not real, he said again, steadier this time, looking directly at Illusion Rias rather than flinching from her. I know what real Butcho sounds like when she's disappointed in me, and it's never actually about whether I'm useful. It's usually about me doing something reckless because I care too much, not too little. He took a breath, and found, to his own mild surprise, that his hands weren't shaking anymore. And real Akino teases me because she likes me, not because she's waiting for an excuse to write me off. And Asia's never once looked at me like that in her entire life, and she never will, because she knows me better than that. The illusions flickered, their cold expressions cracking at the edges like paint peeling away from something underneath. You're afraid this is true, the warden's voice said, distant and layered even within the illusion. That is why it was shown to you. Fear does not require truth to feel real. Yeah, well, Issei said, squaring his shoulders toward the fading shapes of his family's twisted reflections, I've gotten pretty good at telling the difference between something that scares me and something that's actually true. And I know for a fact that the people waiting for me on the other side of that water would rather carry me through 100 trials than leave me behind for a single one. The illusion shattered entirely, the false sunset and the false school building dissolving into darkness that gave way. A heartbeat later, back to the cavern, back to the platform, back to the sound of the others' voices calling his name from across the water. He crossed back the way he'd come, legs a little unsteady but his chest lighter than it had been in hours, and the moment he stepped off the narrow path onto solid ground, Asia threw her arms around him without a word, followed a beat later by Rias, gripping him just as tightly. What did you see? Rias asked quietly, once she'd pulled back enough to study his face. You. All of you. Telling me I wasn't worth keeping around. He managed a small, tired grin. Didn't buy it though. Real you guys are way better company than that. Something in Rias's expression softened into open relief, and she squeezed his shoulder once before stepping back to let the others take their turn approaching. Then let's make sure the rest of us come back with the same certainty. They went one after another after that, Kaneko crossing next with her jaw set and her eyes hard, returning 10 minutes later looking shaken but resolute, refusing to say exactly what she'd faced beyond a quiet admission that it had involved being left behind, alone, the way she so often feared she would be. Zenobia crossed after her, returning almost defiant, muttering something about an illusion daring to suggest her faith made her a burden rather than a strength, and looking thoroughly unimpressed by the attempt. Kiba's trial left him quiet and thoughtful for a long while afterward, though he assured everyone he was fine, that whatever he'd faced had more to do with old ghosts than anything the island had truly invented itself. Irina came back in tears that turned quickly to fierce, bright laughter, insisting her faith had carried her through whatever darkness the platform had shown her, and nobody doubted it for a second. Gasper went next to last, trembling the entire way across despite Aquino walking the water's edge alongside him the whole time, calling encouragement, and when he returned he was crying openly, but Kaneko was there instantly to pull him into a hug, murmuring something too quiet for the others to hear, and whatever he'd faced seemed to loosen its grip the moment she did. Asia crossed near the end, and came back with damp eyes and a soft, unshakable smile, saying only that she'd been shown a version of herself abandoned and unwanted, and that she told that fear, quite calmly, that she already knew what it felt like to be discarded once, and that she had no intention of ever believing it again now that she had people who'd chosen to keep her. Aquino went last, humming something under her breath as she crossed, and when she returned her usual composure had cracked just slightly at the edges, though she waved off Rias's concerned question with a small, genuine smile rather than her usual deflecting humor. I'm all right. It showed me being alone again, the way I was before all of you. I told it that ship had sailed a long time ago. Rias crossed last of all, and the wait, while she was gone, felt longer to Issei than any of the others combined, every second stretching out until finally she stepped back onto solid ground, composed but visibly moved, refusing to elaborate beyond a quiet admission that she'd been shown her peerage scattered and lost because of choices she'd made, and that she'd answered by refusing, flatly, to accept a future where she failed any of them that badly. When the last of them stood together again at the water's edge, the kneeling stone figure at the pool's center caught the light differently, and for just a moment, so brief Issei almost convinced himself he'd imagined it, her carved expression seemed to soften, something like peace passing over features that had been frozen in sorrow for who knew how long. The warden's voice returned, quieter than before, almost reverent. 8 trials faced. 8 fears answered honestly. This, too, is rarer than you know. Rest now. The path forward will not demand more of you again until you are ready to give it. They made camp in the cavern that night, close enough to the still black pool that its faint glow provided just enough light to see by, and for the first time since the storm had scattered them, the mood settled into something genuinely easy, the particular closeness that came from a group of people who had each faced their worst private fear and come out the other side still holding on to one another. Akino took it upon herself to organize what she called, only half joking, a proper celebration, coaxing a small fire to life from driftwood Kiba had gathered near the cavern's mouth and producing, from somewhere in her seemingly bottomless supply pouch, a handful of dried snacks she'd apparently been rationing since before the storm ever hit. Emergency reserves, she said, passing them around with visible satisfaction at the group's grateful reaction. I believe today qualifies as an emergency worth celebrating rather than merely surviving. I'll drink to that, Zenobia said, raising a cup of gathered water like it was something finer, and the small, ridiculous toast that followed set off a wave of tired, genuine laughter that echoed pleasantly around the cavern walls. Issei found himself, later, seated a short distance from the fire with Kaneko, who had wandered off from the main group with Gasper trailing sleepily behind her before settling him down for the night against a smooth patch of stone, tucked in with someone's spare jacket. "You okay?" he asked, once Gasper's breathing had evened out into real sleep. Kaneko was quiet for a moment, watching the small vampire boy's peaceful face rather than looking at Issei directly. "The trials showed me alone. Not abandoned exactly. Just forgotten. Like everyone moved on without noticing I wasn't there anymore. That's not gonna happen. I know." She said it simply, without any of the guarded distance she usually kept around anything emotional. "I actually know that now." "Didn't always." He didn't push further, just settled beside her in comfortable silence, and after a while she leaned her head lightly against his shoulder, the same easy trust she rarely extended so openly, and they sat like that for a long while, watching Gasper sleep and listening to the low murmur of the others' conversation drifting from the fire. Across the cavern, Rias had drawn Kiba a short distance aside, sensing correctly that whatever he'd faced in his own trial had left a residue he hadn't fully shaken off despite his reassurances. "You don't have to tell me what you saw," she said, "but I want you to know you can, if you ever want to." Kiba was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire's reflection on the water. "It showed me my old squad. The ones who died in the Excalibur project." His voice stayed level, though something tight remained underneath it. "Told me I'd replace them. That this family was just a more comfortable version of the same story, and that eventually I'd lose you all too, the way I lost them. And I told it that grief and replacement aren't the same thing." He managed a small, genuine smile, the tightness easing slightly. "That I'm allowed to love the people in front of me without it being a betrayal of the people I lost. Took me a while to actually believe that about myself. Guess the island picked a good moment to make me say it out loud." Rias reached over and squeezed his hand once, warmly. "For what it's worth, I don't think you've ever once treated any of us like a replacement for anything. I think you just have a very large heart, and you keep finding new people worth putting in it. That's uncomfortably poetic for you, Bucho." "I contain multitudes," she said dryly, and Kiba actually laughed, the sound loosening something in his shoulders that had been tense since he'd stepped off that platform. Near the fire itself, Asia had ended up seated beside Irina, the two of them trading quiet, careful conversation about faith, about the strange comfort of finding it tested and holding regardless, until Irina finally voiced something that had clearly been sitting with her since the trial. "Do you think the woman in the water was religious before?" she asked. "Whoever she used to be. I keep thinking about her. About how she must have been so scared, right at the end, that she chose herself over everyone else." "I think fear makes people do things they wouldn't otherwise," Asia said gently. "I don't think it makes her a bad person. Just someone who ran out of whatever she needed to hold on a little longer than she did." "That's very kind of you. I've been scared before too," Asia said simply. "I understand it better than I wish I did." Irina reached over and took her hand, squeezing it once, and the two of them sat together in comfortable quiet for a while longer, watching firelight ripple across the surface of the still black pool. It was Issei, eventually, drawn by restlessness more than anything else, who wandered close enough to the water's edge to get a proper look at the kneeling stone figure at its center, studying the peaceful shift he thought he'd noticed in her expression earlier that evening. You really think she's still in there? He asked quietly, mostly to himself, though Rias's voice answered from just behind him a moment later, having drifted over without his noticing. I think, she said, coming to stand beside him, that whatever this island is, it isn't simply cruel for its own sake. It punishes failure, yes, but it also seems to genuinely want us to succeed. That's an unusual kind of test to design, if all it wanted was to collect more statues. You think we can save her? Whoever she used to be? I don't know, Rias admitted. But I intend to ask, before we're finished here. Whatever this place ultimately wants from us, I don't plan on leaving anyone behind in it, including someone who arrived long before we did. Issei looked at her for a moment, struck, not for the first time, by the particular quality of stubborn compassion that had made him follow her into every impossible situation without hesitation since the day she'd found him. That's why you're the best king anyone could ask for, you know that? Rias's cheeks colored faintly in the firelight, and she bumped her shoulder lightly against his, echoing the same easy gesture he'd shared with half the group already that day. Flattery. From you? How unusual. I contain multitudes, he said, grinning, borrowing her own line back at her, and her surprised laugh carried warm and bright across the cavern, drawing curious glances from the rest of the group gathered around the fire, none of whom needed to ask what had caused it to feel glad, in that moment, for the simple, ordinary sound of it. Morning arrived without any visible sunrise, the cavern simply brightening by degrees until the pale, ambient light that seemed to fill every space on the island returned in full, and the group woke stiff but rested, gathering themselves with the easy efficiency of people who had already survived one full day and night together, and trusted they could survive plenty more. It was Gasper who noticed the change first, tugging at Kaniko's sleeve and pointing toward the pool with wide eyes. The kneeling stone figure was gone. Not destroyed, not crumbled, simply absent, the space where she had knelt now empty water, undisturbed and still as ever, as though she had never been there at all. The group gathered quickly at the water's edge, staring down at the unbroken surface, a tangle of relief and unease passing between them in equal measure. Warden, Rias called, voice carrying clearly across the cavern. What happened to her? The golden light didn't rise from the water this time, but from somewhere above them, drifting down gently like scattered sunlight through leaves. She has been released. Your honesty before her, the trust you extended one another and yourselves, was enough to loosen what held her here. She has gone on, at last, to wherever it is your kind goes when a long delay finally ends. A quiet, stunned silence followed that, until Asia's soft voice broke it. We helped her. Without even meaning to? You helped her by refusing to become what she became, the warden said. That refusal mattered more than you know. I did not expect it, not from a group barely a full day into their trials. You have given me a great deal to reconsider about what I believed this place required. So what happens now? Issei asked. Are we done? Can we go home? Not yet, the warden said, and though the words themselves might have been discouraging, something in the tone carried a warmth it hadn't held before. 2 trials remain of the first tier, and beyond them, deeper tests I am not yet certain you are ready to face, though I confess you are proving me wrong faster than any guests I have hosted in a very long time. But I will tell you this plainly, since you have earned plain answers. The island does not wish to keep you. It wishes only to be certain, before it lets you go, that what you carry back into your own world is worth protecting as fiercely as you have shown you can protect one another here. Rias exchanged a glance with the rest of her peerage, something steady and determined passing silently between all 8 of them. Then let's get to it, she said. Whatever's next. Rest one more turning first, the warden said. You have earned that much, and I do not believe in wasting goodwill on exhaustion. The next path will open when the light above the cavern dims. Until then, this space is yours, safe and undisturbed. The golden light faded, leaving the cavern in its ordinary pale glow, and the group settled back into an easier rhythm, spending the day in the kind of unhurried recovery none of them had allowed themselves since the storm first tore them from Ko. Zenobia and Kiba sparred lightly near the cavern's far wall, more for the familiar comfort of the motion than any real need to train. Aquino and Irina waded into the shallows near the pool's edge, laughing at the cold, and eventually convinced Asia to join them despite her initial protests. Kaneko dozed in a patch of ambient light with Gasper curled against her side, both of them thoroughly unbothered by the world for the first time in days. Issei spent a good portion of the afternoon simply moving between all of them, checking in, trading easy conversation, letting himself feel, for a little while, like the family he'd nearly lost was actually whole and safe and within arm's reach. It was Rias who eventually found him again near sunset, if the slow dimming of ambient light could be called that, settling beside him at the water's edge with the particular quiet of someone who had something on her mind. "You've been a lot steadier through all of this than I expected," she said. "I don't mean that as an insult. I mean it as a genuine observation. Most people, thrown into something like this, panic first and adjust later. You just adjusted." "Guess I've had practice," he said. "Every time something huge and impossible happens to us, it's usually you who has to be the one holding everyone together. Figured it was about time somebody helped carry that." Rias was quiet for a moment, studying him with an expression he couldn't quite place, something warm and a little overwhelmed. "I don't tell you often enough how much that means to me." "You don't have to tell me. I already know." "I'd still like to say it," she said, and reached over to take his hand, lacing her fingers through his with a simple, deliberate certainty that needed no further explanation. They sat like that as the light dimmed fully into the cavern's version of night, watching the still water reflect a sky full of unfamiliar stars, either of them saying much else, content in the particular ease of two people who had already proven, in the ways that mattered most, exactly how far they'd go for each other. When the dimming finally completed and the golden light stirred once more from the depths of the pool, signaling the path ahead had opened, the whole group rose together without needing to be called, 8 silhouettes and one small vampire boy gathering at the cavern's edge, ready, in a way none of them could have managed even 2 days earlier, to meet whatever the island asked of them next. The new path climbed rather than descended, a narrow stair cut directly into rock that wound upward for what felt like a very long time before finally opening onto a wide plateau near the top of what Issei realized, once he stepped out into the open air, must be the tallest point on the entire island. From up here the jungle spread out below them in every direction, a vast unbroken green stretching to a horizon where the ocean finally showed itself again, pale and endless, with no coastline, no ships, no sign whatsoever that anything beyond this island existed at all. "That's not comforting," Zenobia muttered, following his gaze out toward the water. "None of this has been comforting," Kaneko said. "Might as well get used to it." The plateau itself was mostly bare stone, swept clean by wind, except for a wide circle etched deep into the rock at its center, divided into 7 equal wedges like a pie, each wedge holding a single heavy stone pedestal with a shallow basin carved into its top. A thin, unlit brazier stood at the circle's exact middle, cold and waiting. The warden's voice rose with the wind itself this time, carrying across the open plateau from every direction at once. "The second trial asks less of your hearts and more of your hands, though do not mistake it for simple. 7 basins, 7 of you, each must be filled with water carried up from the pool below, using nothing but what you can hold between your own 2 palms. No vessels. No magic, for it remains as dampened here as everywhere else on this island. Only your hands, and the distance, and each other." Issei looked out over the plateau's edge, down the long stair they just climbed, and did some quick, unhappy math. "That's got to be a mile of stairs. And water leaks through your fingers in like 10 seconds. Then you will need more than 10 seconds worth of trips," the warden said, "and more than one pair of hands willing to relay what another pair loses along the way. This is not a trial of strength. It is a trial of whether 8 people can turn a task too large for one person into something manageable for all of them, without anyone deciding early that the effort isn't worth their share of it." 7 basins, Rias said slowly, doing her own count. "But there are 8 of us." "There are," the warden agreed. "Gasper is young yet, and this trial is not his to carry. 7 of you will fill the basins. The 8th may help in whatever way the group decides is best." Gasper's face fell for a moment, clearly bracing to be told he was useless again, but Aquino crouched beside him immediately, and ruffled his hair before he could spiral too far into it. "Don't you dare look like that. Somebody needs to keep count of the trips and make sure nobody collapses from exhaustion halfway up those stairs. That's an important job, and I trust you to do it properly. Really? Really, Rias confirmed. You'll be our lookout and our record keeper. If any of us starts pushing too hard, you tell us. That's not a small task, Gasper. That might be the most important one up here. That settled something visibly in him, his shoulders straightening as he nodded seriously, and Issei felt a small, warm rush of pride at how naturally the group had found a way to fold him into the work rather than leave him standing uselessly on the sidelines. They worked out a rough system quickly after that, Rias assigning rough shifts so no one basin sat neglected too long, and the group split into a loose relay down the long stair, cupping water clumsily from the pool below and racing back up, losing most of it through their fingers with every step exactly as the warden had warned. It was slow, frustrating work, and within the first hour Issei's legs burned worse than they had after any training session Rias had ever put him through. It was Zenobia, breathing hard after her 4th trip, who first floated the idea that changed everything. We're doing this wrong. One person, cupped hands, loses almost everything before they're even halfway up. But if 2 people link their hands together, side by side, the surface area is bigger, and it holds longer. I noticed it by accident on my last trip when Kiba grabbed my arm to keep me from slipping and some of the water sloshed into his palm instead of spilling. Worth testing, Kiba said, and the 2 of them demonstrated it a moment later, palms pressed together into a wider makeshift bowl, managing to carry noticeably more water up the first several dozen steps before it finally began leaking through the seams. From there the whole approach shifted, pairs forming and reforming along the stair, passing cupped water hand to hand in a human chain rather than each person making the exhausting full climb alone, Kaneko and Asia relaying near the bottom where the incline was gentlest, Aquino and Irina managing the steep middle stretch, Issei and Rias anchoring the final push to the top where tired legs made every step count double. Gasper, true to his new role, kept careful track of whose turn it was to rest, calling out encouragement from the plateau's edge and, more than once, catching Irina by the sleeve when exhaustion made her stumble on the final stretch, exactly the kind of watchfulness the trial apparently valued as much as raw effort. By the time the sun, or whatever passed for it on this island, had crawled halfway toward the horizon, 4 of the 7 basins stood filled to their brims, and the group had settled into an easy, practiced rhythm that made the remaining work feel less like punishment and more like something they were simply doing together, the way any family might split chores nobody particularly enjoyed. You know, Issei said, catching his breath beside Rias during a brief pause near the top of the stairs, both of them soaked through from spilled water and sweat in equal measure. For a trial about carrying water up a mountain, this is somehow one of the least miserable things that's happened to us since we got here. Rias laughed, tired and genuine, wiping a damp strand of hair from her face. I think that might be the point. It's not really about the water at all. Yeah, he said, looking down the long stair at the rest of their family working in easy tandem below, Kaneko and Asia laughing at something, Aquino teasing Irina about her form, Kiba and Zenobia bickering companionably over the fastest route down. Yeah, I got that a while ago. The 7th and final basin filled just as the light began its slow, familiar dim toward evening, and the moment the last handful of water spilled over its rim, every basin on the plateau caught fire at once, not with heat, but with the same soft, golden glow the warden's voice always carried, each flame rising gently from its basin without consuming a single drop of the water beneath it. The group collapsed where they stood, exhausted in the particular satisfied way that came from real, honest effort rather than fear, and for a while nobody said anything at all, content simply to lie on sun-warmed stone and catch their breath while the 7 small flames flickered steadily around them. 2 trials complete, the warden said, voice carrying a warmth that had grown steadily since the first evening in the cavern. You have done, in a handful of days, what I have in the past seen groups fail to accomplish across many months. I confess I did not expect to be moved by watching 8 strangers to this island learn to carry water for one another, but I find that I was. Does that mean we're close to done? Irina asked, hopeful despite the exhaustion in her voice. Closer than you were, the warden said, which was, as ever, not quite a straight answer though it carried less evasion than usual. The first tier of trials tests whether a group can survive itself, its own fear and its own fatigue. You have passed that tier more thoroughly than I expected. What lies beyond is a second tier, and it will ask harder things of you, not because I wish to punish you, but because what waits beyond this island's barrier is not gentle, and I will not release you unprepared into it." That got everyone's attention, even Gasper looking up sharply from where he'd been dozing against Kaniko's side. Rias sat up fully, some of the day's tiredness burning off in an instant of focus. "What do you mean, what waits beyond the barrier? You said we were pulled here by a storm. Are you saying something is actually hunting us?" "Not hunting," the warden said, and for the first time, something like genuine reluctance crept into its layered voice. "But the storm that brought you here was not an accident of nature, nor was it entirely my doing, though I confess I have long used such storms to gather guests I judge worth testing. There are others, beyond this place, who take a very different interest in stray devils, angels, and fallen scattered far from their own protections. I intervened when your group crossed into range because I judged you worth saving from that interest, not merely worth testing for my own purposes." "Saved us from what?" Zenobia said flatly, hand already drifting toward Durandal out of pure instinct. "That is a conversation for when you are stronger," the warden said, "and I do not say that to withhold information cruelly, only because I have learned, across many guests and many years, that fear given too early curdles into paralysis rather than preparation. Trust that I have kept you safe this far, and trust that the trials ahead will make you safer still, and when you are ready to hear the rest, I will not hide it from you." Rias exchanged a long look with the rest of her peerage, and Issei could see the calculation running behind her eyes, the same one he was running himself, weighing how much to push against an answer they weren't being given yet. In the end, it was Rias who spoke for all of them, her voice steady despite the new weight the warden's words had settled over the group. "All right," she said. "We'll trust you a little further. But I want it understood clearly that the moment we're ready, you tell us everything. No more riddles." "Agreed," the warden said, and something in the single word carried what almost sounded like relief. "Rest tonight where you are. The plateau is safe, and the view, I think, is worth enjoying honestly for once rather than treating it only as the site of a trial. Tomorrow, the path to the second tier will open, and I suspect, given how quickly you have surprised me so far, that it will not take you long to surprise me again." The golden light dimmed back into the 7 small flames flickering steadily around the basins, and the plateau settled into an easy quiet, the group gradually pulling themselves upright to arrange a proper camp for the night. Using the 7 basins' soft light in place of a fire none of them had the energy left to build. Issei found himself, once the worst of the exhaustion had eased, seated near the plateau's edge beside Asia, both of them looking out over the vast dark spread of jungle below, dotted here and there with patches of pale, faintly glowing flowers visible even from this height. "Are you scared?" Asia asked quietly. "About what?" it said. "About something out there looking for stray devils." "A little," he admitted, because there wasn't much point lying to her about it, not after everything they'd already survived together. "But I figure whatever it is, we've got a better shot facing it as the family we've turned into this week than we would have had as whatever we were before the storm hit." Asia considered that, then nodded slowly, some of the worry easing from her expression. "I think you're right. I think that's rather the whole point of everything the island's been asking of us. See, you're getting good at this cryptic ancient guardian logic. Careful, or it's gonna recruit you." She laughed, soft and warm, and leaned her head against his shoulder the way she had that first night by the fire, and together they sat and watched the strange stars come out one by one over an island that had, in the space of a handful of days, asked more of them than most of a lifetime back home, and had, so far, given back in equal measure everything it had taken. Behind them, scattered across the plateau in the golden light of 7 small flames, the rest of their family settled in for the night, tired and sore and thoroughly unbothered by any of it, secure for the first time since the storm in the simple, hard-won knowledge that whatever waited beyond this island's barrier, they would meet it exactly the way they had met everything else since the sky over Ko had turned that impossible color. Together, and without a single one of them left behind. Morning came gently, the ambient light rising by slow degrees over the plateau until the 7 basin flames finally guttered out on their own, their purpose apparently spent now that the trial behind them was well and truly finished. The group woke stiff from sleeping on open stone, but in far better spirits than the exhaustion of the day before might have predicted, trading easy jokes about who had snored loudest and who had stolen the most blanket space from whom, until Rias finally called them all to order with the particular gentle firmness that meant it was time to move. The warden said the path to the second tier would open this morning, she said, scanning the plateau. I don't see anything yet. Maybe it's waiting for us to actually finish breakfast first, Issei said, around a mouthful of the last of their gathered fruit. Very considerate ancient guardian energy, honestly. As if in answer, the wide circle etched into the plateau's center, the one that had held the 7 basins, began to glow along its inscribed lines, the same soft gold that colored everything the warden touched, and slowly, silently, the stone within the circle simply was not there anymore, replaced by a wide opening that dropped away into darkness, a stairway spiraling down into the heart of the island itself. That's ominous, Aquino said cheerfully, peering over the edge. I do love a good ominous staircase. You would, Zenobia muttered, though she was already moving toward it, checking Durandal's weight at her hip out of pure habit. The warden's voice rose to meet them as they gathered at the stair's edge, quieter than before, almost solemn. What lies below is the second tier, and I will not pretend to you that it asks less of you than the first. It asks more. The trials there will not simply test your trust in one another, for you have proven that thoroughly already. They will test what you are willing to risk, and what you are willing to give up, in defense of what you have built here together. I do not say this to frighten you away. I say it because you have earned honesty, and because I believe, more than I believed a handful of days ago, that you are equal to it. Rias looked around at her peerage, at Issei's steady readiness, at Aquino's easy confidence, at Asia's quiet resolve, at Kaniko's watchful calm with Gasper close at her side, at Zenovia's unshaken determination, at Kiba's thoughtful focus, at Irina's bright, unwavering faith, and found, in the sum of all of it, more certainty than she'd felt since the storm first tore them from Ko. We're ready, she said, and meant it completely. Then descend, the warden said, and know that whatever the second tier shows you, I will be watching, and I will not let this family fall to something it hasn't truly earned the chance to face. One by one, they stepped onto the spiraling stair, Issei falling into step beside Rias near the front of the group, Asia's hand finding his once more as the darkness below rose up to meet them, and behind them, the wide opening in the plateau stone began, slowly, to seal itself shut, the last daylight of the first tier narrowing to a thin gold seam and then vanishing entirely, leaving nothing but the steady golden glow of the stairway itself to light the way down into whatever waited for them. Next, the stair wound down far longer than any of them expected, the air growing cooler and stranger with every turn, until the golden glow lighting their steps gave way gradually to a deeper, more distant light rising from somewhere below, tinged faintly blue, pulsing in a slow rhythm that reminded Issei uncomfortably of a heartbeat. Nobody spoke much during the descent, the easy chatter of the plateau fading into the particular focused quiet a group falls into when it senses, without needing to be told outright, that whatever comes next deserves its full attention. Anyone else feel like the air's gotten heavier? Issei finally asked, breaking the silence more to steady his own nerves than out of any real expectation someone would explain it. It has, Kiba said. Pressure's different down here. Feels almost like being underwater without actually being underwater. Comforting, Zenobia said dryly, echoing Issei's own earlier complaint about the ocean view, and a few tired, tense laughs rippled through the group despite themselves. Asia's grip on Issei's hand tightened slightly as the stair finally leveled out, opening into a passage wide enough for them to walk two abreast, its walls no longer bare stone but instead lined with the same carved figures they'd seen throughout the island, women in flowing robes, hands raised in gestures Issei still couldn't decode, except here, unlike the courtyard above, several of the carvings had been damaged. Deep gouges scored across stone faces and folded hands, as though something long ago had tried, and failed, to erase them entirely. Somebody didn't like this place very much, Kaniko said quietly, running her fingers along one of the damaged carvings without quite touching the scarred stone itself. Or something, Rias murmured, and didn't elaborate further, though Issei noticed she kept one hand resting lightly near the hilt of the sword she'd taken to carrying since the storm, ready, the way she always seemed to be, for a fight none of the rest of them could quite see coming yet. The passage bent one final time, opening at last into a vast chamber lit by that same slow, pulsing blue light, and whatever waited for them within it, Issei understood immediately, staring out across a space far larger and far stranger than anything the island had shown them so far, would be unlike any trial they had already survived. This was something else entirely, something the warden's careful, patient voice had been building them towards since the very first morning on the beach, and as the whole group came to a stop at the chamber's threshold, drawing close together without needing to be told to, Issei felt Drake stir at his wrist, quiet and watchful, sensing, as clearly as he did, that the easier part of their journey through this island had, at last, well and truly ended. The chamber beyond the passage was, without question, the largest space they had yet found on the island, its far walls lost entirely to distance and shadow, the pulsing blue light rising not from any torch or brazier but from a vast, still lake that filled most of the chamber's floor, its surface glowing faintly from somewhere deep beneath, like a heartbeat visible through skin. A narrow causeway of pale stone crossed the lake in a straight line toward a raised dais on the far side, and standing at its edge, waiting for them with an ease that suggested it had known exactly when they would arrive, was a figure none of them had seen before, tall and slender, wrapped in robes the same pale stone gray as the carvings throughout the island. Its face smooth and featureless except for 2 points of that same slow blue light where eyes might otherwise have been. Issei's hand went instinctively to the boosted gear. And he wasn't the only one, Zenovia's grip tightening on Durandal, Kiba's hand drifting toward the hilt of his own blade. But the figure made no move toward them at all, simply inclining its head in something like a bow. Peace, the warden's voice said, though it seemed to rise from the figure itself now rather than from the air around them, the layered quality of it unmistakable even filtered through an unfamiliar mouth. This is the only form I can take within these deeper halls, where my presence must be more than simply a voice on the wind. Do not be alarmed. I am the same guide who has walked beside you since the beach. You could have mentioned you had a body, Issei muttered, lowering his guards slowly. I rarely need one. Here I do, for what I must show you cannot be spoken plainly. It must be witnessed. The figure turned, gesturing toward the glowing lake behind it, where the light beneath the surface seemed to pulse a little faster, as though responding to its attention. This is the deep mirror. It remembers everything that has ever crossed this island's barrier, guest and threat alike. Before I ask the second tier of you, I believe you have earned the truth I promised on the plateau. Rias stepped forward, chin lifted, every inch the heiress prepared to hear something difficult. Then show us. The warden inclined its head again, and raised one pale hand over the water. The glow beneath the surface brightened all at once, resolving into shapes, images rippling up through the depths like a memory being poured directly into the chamber's air, and the group watched, transfixed, as the deep mirror began to tell them the story it had clearly been waiting to tell. They saw, first, the island as it must have looked centuries ago, whole and thriving, not a ruin but a living sanctuary, its courtyards full of a great many more of the pale flowers, its statues unweathered and bright, and moving among them, dozens of figures, devils and angels and fallen and stranger things besides, living together in a peace none of them had words for back in their own fractured world. This place was built, the warden said, long before your factions drew their current lines, by beings who grew tired of watching young and powerful stray creatures, cut loose from whatever home had once claimed them, fall prey to those who valued their power more than their lives. It became a refuge. A place strays could be found, and tested, and strengthened, before being released back into a world that would otherwise have consumed them. The image shifted, darkening, the bright courtyards giving way to shapes moving at the island's edges, hooded and numerous, testing the barrier with slow, patient hunger. They call themselves the Harvesters, the warden continued, and for the first time since Issei had met it, something like real anger colored its layered voice. A faction belonging to no single side of your wars, devil nor angel nor fallen, interested only in collecting power wherever it finds it unguarded. Strays are their favorite prey, precisely because no faction claims them, and therefore no faction avenges them when they vanish. That's what almost got us, Rias said quietly, putting the pieces together. The storm that pulled us here. It wasn't random. It was not, the warden confirmed. Your raiding game drew attention. The Katara faction you fought was already compromised, infiltrated, its rogue elements acting as bait to draw a young and powerful peerage into open, unprotected space. I intervened before the harvesters could close their net, and brought you here instead, to this place, where the same barrier that keeps you in also keeps them out, for now. For now, Zenobia repeated flatly. Meaning it won't hold forever. Meaning nothing holds forever, the warden said, and I would rather send you back into your own world prepared to defend yourselves against what hunted you, than keep you here indefinitely under a protection that cannot follow you home. That is what the second tier is truly for. Not simply trust, which you have already proven. Strength, and the willingness to give something of yourselves in defense of what you love, for that is precisely what the harvesters will demand of you, given the chance, and I would rather you learn to give it freely here than have it taken from you there. The images in the deep mirror faded slowly back into placid blue light, and the chamber settled into a heavy, thoughtful silence, 8 teenagers and one small vampire boy absorbing the sudden, sharp edges of a threat that had, until this moment, remained comfortably abstract. All right, Rias said finally, her voice steady despite everything. Tell us what the second tier requires. Sacrifice, the warden said simply. Not of blood, and not of life. I do not deal in cruelty for its own sake, whatever the carved figure in the earlier pool may have led you to fear. But each trial ahead will ask you to give up something you value, temporarily or otherwise, in service of the group's survival, and I will not soften how difficult some of those choices may prove to be. Aquino crossed her arms, studying the featureless blue eyes of the warden's borrowed face with open scrutiny. You keep promising us difficulty and then acting almost sorry about it. Which is it? Are you protecting us or testing us? Both, the warden said, without hesitation. I have never found the two to be separate things worth protecting. Come. The first trial of this tier lies across the causeway, and I think, once you see it, you will understand exactly why I waited until now to show you the truth of what waits beyond this island's borders. The causeway held steady beneath their feet as they crossed, the glowing lake rippling faintly on either side with the last echoes of the vision it had shown them, and the dais on the far side, when they reached it, held nothing more dramatic than 7 simple stone pedestals arranged in a loose circle, each one bare except for a small, unlit lantern resting at its center. 7 lanterns, Kaneko said, echoing the pattern that had become familiar across every trial so far. Let me guess. Something has to be given up to light them. Precisely so, the warden said, its borrowed form standing at the circle's edge with its hands folded, patient as ever. Each lantern lights only when the one who kneels before it offers something true. Not an object, though objects may serve as a focus if you wish. A piece of yourself. A comfort you have carried, a certainty you have leaned on, something whose absence you will genuinely feel once it is given. I will not tell you what to offer. Only you know what you are truly holding on to. And if we offer something small, Zenobia said, testing the edges of the trial the way she tested everything, something that doesn't actually cost us much, then the lantern will not light, the warden said simply, and you will know, better than I could ever tell you, that you have not yet been honest with yourself about what matters. They spread out slowly around the circle, each finding a pedestal, and Issei found himself kneeling before his with a strange, hollow feeling in his chest, turning over every part of himself he could think of and coming up, again and again, against the same uncomfortable truth. He knew exactly what this trial wanted from him. He just didn't want to give it. Across the circle, Aquino knelt at her own pedestal for a long moment before finally closing her eyes, her usual playful composure falling away into something rawer than Issei had ever seen from her. I offer, she said quietly, the anger I've carried against my father for as long as I can remember. Not forgiveness. I'm not ready for that, and I don't think this trial is asking for it. Just the constant weight of carrying it everywhere I go, deciding who I am before I've even had the chance to decide for myself. The lantern before her flickered once, twice, and caught, burning with a small, steady blue flame, and Aquino let out a breath that sounded like it had been held for years. Beside her, Kaneko knelt in silence for a long while before speaking, her voice smaller than Issei had ever heard it. I offer the fear that I'll turn out like my sister. That whatever's wrong with her is wrong with me too, just waiting. I've been so scared of it that I've never let myself actually miss her, not properly, because missing her felt like admitting I might follow. Her lantern caught as well, and she stayed kneeling a moment longer, one hand pressed briefly to her chest, before rising and stepping back with something loosened in her posture that hadn't been there a moment before. Zenovia's offering came out clipped and almost defiant, though the words themselves carried more vulnerability than her tone let on. I offer the certainty that faith has to look like everyone else's faith to count. That because mine's different, sharper, less gentle than Irina's, it's somehow worth less. Her lantern caught immediately, flaring brighter than most of the others, and she looked faintly startled by her own success, as though she hadn't expected the trial to take her seriously. Irina, beside her, offered something entirely different, her usual bright certainty cracking just slightly at the edges. I offer the fear that being cheerful all the time is the only reason anyone wants me around. That if I ever stopped smiling through everything, I'd find out I wasn't actually needed at all. Her lantern caught slower than the others, but caught all the same, and Zenobia reached over without a word and squeezed her hand once she'd finished. Kiba took the longest of anyone, kneeling in silence for so long that Issei began to worry, before he finally spoke, voice quiet and steady. I offer the guilt of surviving the Excalibur project when so many of my squad didn't. I've turned that guilt into fuel for a long time, telling myself I owe every good thing I do to the people I lost. I think it's time I got to do good things simply because I want to, not because I'm still trying to pay off a debt that was never actually mine to owe. His lantern caught, gently, steadily, and something in his shoulders eased that Issei suspected had been tense for years. Asia knelt at her pedestal with her hands folded, and when she spoke, her voice was soft but entirely sure. I offer the belief that my worth depends on how useful I am to the people I love. That if I ever stopped being able to heal, stopped being able to help, I'd have nothing left to offer them, and they'd have no reason to keep me. Her lantern caught at once, bright and warm, and she pressed a hand briefly to her chest with an expression of quiet, hard-won relief. Rias went next to last, and when she finally spoke, her voice carried the particular weight of someone offering up something she'd never said out loud to anyone. I offer the fear that I'll lose everyone I've ever built a family out of, the way I nearly lost my freedom to an arranged marriage, the way this world takes from people like me whether or not I've earned it. I offer the certainty that keeping everyone safe is entirely my responsibility alone, because I don't think that's true anymore. I think it's all of ours, together. Her lantern caught, strong and steady, and she looked, in the aftermath, more lightly held together than Issei had seen her since the storm first hit, which left only Issei, kneeling before the last unlit lantern, the hollow feeling in his chest sharpening into something he could finally name. I offer, he said slowly, the idea that I have to be the strongest one in the room to matter. That being Sekiryutai, being the guy who can boost past his limits, is the only reason anyone would ever choose to keep me around instead of just liking me for who I actually am underneath all that. He let out a breath, surprised by how much lighter the admission left him. I've been so scared that if I ever stopped being useful in a fight, everyone would realize there wasn't much else worth sticking around for. The lantern caught immediately, burning steady and warm, and across the circle, Asia was already moving toward him before he'd even fully risen, wrapping her arms around him with a fierceness that told him, more clearly than words could have, exactly how wrong that fear had always been. All 7 lanterns burned now in a loose ring around the dais, and the warden, watching from the circle's edge, inclined its head with something that, on a more human face, might have been called deep and genuine approval. Well offered, it said. All of it. You have given up nothing that made you weaker, and everything that was quietly making you smaller than you deserved to be. That is precisely the sacrifice this trial asks for, and precisely the sacrifice the harvesters could never predict from a group as bonded as you have become. They rested at the edge of the glowing lake once the lanterns had burned themselves down to a low, steady flicker, the whole group settling into the particular loose, easy quiet that came after something genuinely difficult had been survived together. Gasper, who had watched the entire trial from a respectful distance, having been told gently by Rias that this particular offering was one only the 7 of them could make, curled up against Kaniko's side the moment she sat down, and she let him without complaint, one hand resting absently in his hair. That was harder than the water trial, Issei admitted, stretching out on the cool stone with his hands behind his head. And I carried water up a literal mountain. Some weights aren't measured in distance, Asia said, settling beside him with a small, tired smile. Very wise. You've been hanging around Bucho too long. I heard that, Rias said, without any real heat behind it, and the group's answering laughter carried easily across the still blue water. Akino, seated near the lake's edge with her knees drawn up to her chest, was quieter than usual, watching the last of the light beneath the surface pulse slow and steady. Issei noticed, the way he'd been noticing all of them more carefully since the trials began, and after a moment he got up and went to sit beside her, not saying anything at first, just letting his presence be enough. I've never said that out loud before, she said eventually, not looking at him. About my father. Not to anyone. Not even to Rias, and she knows more of my history than almost anyone alive. How's it feel? Having said it now? She considered the question seriously, which was rare enough for her that Issei found himself genuinely curious about the answer. Lighter, she admitted finally. Which is strange, because nothing about the actual situation with my father has changed. He's still exactly who he was yesterday. But I think I've been carrying him around like a weight I owed some kind of debt to, and today I think I finally set some of it down. For what it's worth, Issei said, you don't owe anybody your anger. Not even him. You get to decide what you carry and what you don't. Akino turned to look at him properly then, something warm and unguarded passing over her expression before her usual teasing smile crept back in, softer than her usual version of it. When did you get so good at saying the right thing, Issei? It's very unfair to the rest of us who've had to work at it. I contain multitudes, he said, borrowing the line for what felt like the 10th time that week, and Akino laughed, bright and genuine, leaning her head briefly against his shoulder before straightening again, some of the earlier heaviness gone from her posture entirely. Across the chamber, Rias had drawn Kiba into a similar quiet conversation, the two of them seated near one of the darkened pedestals while Zenobia and Irina compared notes a short distance away about their own offerings, Irina insisting, with typical enthusiasm, that she felt about 10 pounds lighter, and intended to test that theory by seeing how high she could jump once they found solid ground again. You survived the hardest thing this island's asked of us yet, Rias told Kiba, watching him carefully. How do you feel? Lighter, he admitted, echoing Akino's word without having heard her say it. I think I've been so busy honoring the squad I lost that I forgot honoring them and living fully for myself weren't actually opposite goals. I can do both. I think I finally believe that. Good, Rias said simply, and squeezed his shoulder once before letting the conversation settle into comfortable silence, the two of them watching the rest of their family scattered easily around the glowing lake, tired and lighter and thoroughly, unmistakably still whole. It was the warden's borrowed form, drifting back toward them from wherever it had withdrawn to during their rest, that finally broke the peaceful lull, its blue eyes catching the lake's glow as it approached. You have earned a longer rest than I am able to offer you, it said, and something in its tone carried genuine regret. But the barrier's strength depends, in part, on how quickly guests complete their trials, and I have felt it thinning since the moment I showed you the truth of the harvesters. I do not say this to rush you unfairly. I say it because I would rather be honest about the cost of delay than let you discover it unprepared. Rias rose immediately, all business again, the softness of a moment ago folding neatly back beneath her usual steady authority. Then let's not delay. What's next? A trial unlike the ones before it, the warden said. Not sacrifice this time, but strength, tested directly. There is a guardian bound to this island's deepest chamber, ancient and not unkind, whose task has always been to measure whether a group's power matches its unity. You will need to fight it, together, until it judges you capable of defending what you have built here against something far less kind than itself. A fight, Zenobia said, already rising with open, undisguised eagerness. Finally. I was beginning to think this island only knew how to make us cry. It has also made you laugh, and rest, and trust, the warden said, something almost fond in its layered voice. But yes. Now it will also ask you to fight, and I suspect, given everything I have already seen from you, that this trial will trouble you rather less than the ones behind you. Don't jinx it, Kaneko muttered, though she was already stretching out the tension of the earlier trial from her shoulders, settling into the loose, ready posture Issei recognized from countless sparring sessions back in Ko. Lead the way, Rias said, and the warden inclined its head once more before turning toward a second passage opening at the chamber's far edge, one none of them had noticed until this exact moment, dark and waiting, promising, in its own silent way, exactly the kind of fight the group had unconsciously been craving since the trials first began. The passage opened into a chamber unlike anything they had encountered so far, circular and vast, its ceiling lost entirely to darkness far overhead, its floor a smooth expanse of pale stone marked with concentric rings that pulsed faintly with the same slow blue light as the deep mirror below. At the chamber's center, motionless, stood a guardian carved from stone and threaded through with veins of that same glowing light, humanoid in shape but easily 3 times Issei's height, its featureless head tilted slightly as though listening for their arrival. That, Issei said, is a lot bigger than I was picturing. Its name, if it has ever needed one, has been lost even to me, the warden said, its borrowed form standing well clear of the outer ring. It has stood here since the island's founding, and it does not fight to harm, only to measure. It will not strike to kill, and I ask that you extend it the same restraint. This is a test of coordination, not destruction. Define measure, Zenobia said, already drawing Durandal with open anticipation. It will press until your formation breaks, or until you prove it cannot be broken, the warden said. Fight as you would fight anything that threatened your family, and it will know, better than words could tell it, whether you are ready for what waits beyond this island. The guardian's glowing veins brightened all at once, and it moved, faster than something its size had any right to move, closing half the chamber's width in a single stride before Rias's shouted command scattered the group into the formation they drilled 100 times back in Ko. Zenobia and Kiba stepping forward to meet the first heavy blow head-on, blades flashing as they redirected rather than absorbed the guardian's massive fist. Akino already airborne and gathering lightning at her fingertips, Kaneko dropping low to sweep in beneath the guardian's guard the moment its attention fixed on the 2 swordsmen in front of it. Issei felt Drake's familiar surge of readiness at his wrist. Partner, this one's strong. Genuinely strong. I'd suggest not holding back out of politeness. Wasn't planning to, Issei said, and let the boosted gear's power build, the familiar rhythm of doubling strength settling over him like an old, comfortable coat, before he drove forward to add his own weight to the guardian's other flank, Rias's crimson power of destruction scoring a glancing hit against its shoulder at nearly the same instant. The fight that followed was unlike anything the earlier trials had asked of them, fast and physical and genuinely demanding, the guardian proving every bit as formidable as the warden had warned, its massive fist cratering stone where the group barely managed to scatter clear in time, its reach forcing Kiba and Zenobia to work in close, practiced tandem simply to keep from being separated. But it never once struck to actually connect with full force, always pulling its blows at the last possible instant, and Issei realized, somewhere in the chaos, that it truly was testing them rather than trying to hurt them, probing for the exact moment their formation might crack under sustained pressure. That moment never came. Every time the guardian pressed hard enough to threaten breaking one flank, someone was already there to reinforce it, Akino's lightning covering the gap when Kaneko overextended, Asia's healing light steadying Kiba's arm the instant a glancing blow numbed it, Irina's blade catching an attack meant for Gasper, who had insisted, over Rias's initial objection, on staying close enough to the fight to warn everyone of openings only his keen vampire senses could track in time. Issei found his own rhythm settling into the space between Rias and Zenobia, boosting past his usual limits again and again, catching blows meant for both of them, driving the guardian's attention back toward himself whenever it threatened to split its focus too widely across the group. It was exhausting, sweat-soaked, genuinely dangerous work, and it was, he realized somewhere in the middle of it, also exactly the kind of fight he'd been quietly craving since the storm first tore them away from everything familiar, a chance to actually use everything the island had spent days building in him, in service of the people he loved. The Guardian's assault finally began to slow after what felt like an hour but might have been far less, its glowing veins dimming by careful degrees as it absorbed blow after coordinated blow without once finding the gap it seemed to be searching for. When it finally lowered its massive fists and stepped back toward the chamber's center, the light within it settling into a calm, steady pulse rather than the aggressive brightness it had carried throughout the fight. The whole group came to a ragged, breathless halt, bruised and exhausted but entirely, triumphantly intact. Formation held, Rias said, chest heaving, though there was open pride in her voice. The whole way through. Told you it'd be less bad than crying, Zenobia said to Kaneko, grinning despite a long scrape along one forearm that Asia was already moving to heal. I never said crying was worse, Kaneko said, though she was grinning too, an unusually open expression for her, as she let Zenobia haul her back upright from where the Guardian's last near miss had knocked her briefly off her feet. The Warden's borrowed form approached the now still Guardian, resting one pale hand against its stone chest with something like genuine affection. Well fought, it said, and the words seemed meant for the Guardian as much as for the group. It has been a long while since anyone made this old friend work quite so hard for its answer. So we passed? Issei asked, still catching his breath. You passed thoroughly, the Warden confirmed, turning back to face them, its blue eyes carrying an expression Issei still couldn't quite decode on a face without features to shape it. Better, in truth, than I expected even after everything you have already shown me. There remains one final trial in this tier, though I confess it is not one I control directly, and I would ask you to rest fully before facing it, for it will not wait for your convenience the way the others have. Something in the shift of its tone set Issei's nerves on edge all over again, the easy triumph of the fight cooling quickly into wary attention. What do you mean, not when you control? The Warden was quiet for a long moment, and when it finally answered, its voice carried a weight none of them had heard from it before, not even during the revelation at the deep mirror. I mean, it said that the barrier has thinned further while you fought, and I can feel, quite clearly now, that it is no longer only my choice whether this island remains hidden. Something has found the edge of it. Something patient, and hungry, and very much not interested in waiting for you to finish resting before it tests you in a manner considerably less kind than I have. The words landed in the chamber like a physical weight, and for a moment nobody moved at all, the triumphant afterglow of the Guardian's trial draining out of the group as quickly as it had risen. Rias was the first to recover, snapping back into the sharp, focused command Issei had watched her wear 100 times before, in 100 smaller crises that had nonetheless prepared her, apparently, for exactly this one. How long, she said, before whatever's found the barrier actually gets through it? I do not know precisely, the Warden admitted, and the honesty in it was somehow worse than a reassuring lie would have been. Hours, perhaps. Not days. The barrier has held strong for centuries against casual searching, but the harvesters do not search casually, and I believe, given how directly your raiding game drew their attention before I intervened, that they have dedicated real resources to finding you specifically. Then we don't rest, Zenobia said immediately, already checking Durandal's edge out of pure reflex. We prepare. You will need both, the Warden said. Rest enough to fight clearly, and preparation enough to fight well. I can buy you a little time by reinforcing what remains of the barrier myself, though it will cost me dearly to do so, and I intend to spend that cost without hesitation. Why? Asia asked quietly, the question that had clearly been sitting with more than one of them since the deep mirror's revelation. Why do this for us? You don't know us. You didn't have to save us from that storm at all. The Warden considered the question for a long moment, its borrowed blue eyes drifting toward the Guardian standing quiet and still at the chamber's center. I have watched a great many strays pass through this island across a great many years, it said finally. Some leave whole. Some, as you have already seen, do not. But every single one of them arrived here believing, on some level, that they were disposable. Unclaimed. Not worth the trouble of protecting. I built my entire purpose, long ago, around proving that belief wrong, one guest at a time. You are simply the latest, and I confess, the most thoroughly deserving of the effort that I have hosted in longer than I care to admit. Rias's expression softened at that, just slightly, before hardening back into focus. Then let's make sure that effort isn't wasted. What do you need from us to buy that time? Only your trust in what remains of the plan, the Warden said. Return to the plateau above. It is the most defensible position on the island, open ground with clear lines of sight in every direction, and the 7 basins there still hold a measure of the light your own sacrifice trial kindled within them. That light will aid you if the barrier fails before I can reinforce it fully. I will hold what I can from below. You're not coming with us, Kiba said, understanding first. I cannot, the warden said. What I must do to strengthen the barrier requires me to remain close to its foundation, here, in the deepest part of the island. I will not be able to speak with you again until it is done, one way or another. The chamber went quiet at that, the full weight of what was being asked settling over the group, and it was Issei, finally, who stepped forward and spoke the thing they were all clearly thinking. You've spent this whole time making sure none of us ever felt alone facing something scary, he said. Kind of feels wrong to just leave you down here alone to do the scariest part yourself. Something in the warden's borrowed expression shifted, and though its stone face had no real capacity for warmth, its voice carried enough for both. That may be the kindest thing any guest has said to me in longer than you would believe. But this is my burden to carry, built into what I am from the very foundation of this island. Yours is to be ready for whatever comes through if I fail to hold it. Go. Please. Every moment you spend arguing with me is a moment better spent preparing. Rias held its gaze a moment longer, then nodded once, sharp and decisive. We'll be ready. And when this is over, we're having a much longer conversation about what happens to you once we leave, because I don't like the idea of walking away and simply hoping you'll still be here whenever the next stray needs finding. A generous thought, the warden said, something almost startled in its tone, as though the idea genuinely hadn't occurred to it in quite that shape before. We will speak of it, I promise, once there is breath left to spare on anything but survival. Now go. They went, moving quickly back through the passage and up the long spiraling stair, the easy, tired camaraderie of the Guardian's trial replaced by the tight, focused urgency of a family bracing for a fight they hadn't chosen the timing of, and Issei found himself, climbing 2 steps at a time behind Rias, running through every scrap of training he'd ever absorbed, every boosted limit he'd ever pushed past, hoping, quietly and fiercely, that it would all turn out to be enough. The plateau, when they finally emerged onto it, looked exactly as they'd left it, the 7 basins still holding their quiet residue of golden light, the sky above unchanged and pale, though the air itself felt different now, charged with a tension that hadn't been there before, a pressure Issei could feel prickling against his skin even without any visible sign of what was causing it. Positions, Rias said, and the group fell into them without needing further instruction, the same defensive formation they drilled endlessly back in Ko, Zenobia and Kiba anchoring the front, Aquino and Irina holding the flanks where their ranged power could cover the widest angles, Kaneko crouched low and ready near the center, Asia stationed just behind the front line where her healing could reach anyone who needed it fastest. Gasper tucked close to her with Rias positioned to move wherever the fight demanded her most. Issei took the position he'd claimed without thinking during the Guardian's trial, close to Rias, ready to boost past his limits the instant anyone needed the extra weight of his strength added to theirs. They waited. The waiting stretched longer than any of them found comfortable, the plateau's pale light dimming gradually toward whatever passed for evening on the island, until finally, without warning, the air at the plateau's edge shimmered and tore, not with the violent, chaotic energy of the storm that had first brought them here, but with something colder, more deliberate, a controlled rupture that peeled open like a wound rather than a doorway. Figures stepped through it, 3 of them, wrapped in dark, featureless cloaks that gave away nothing of what stood beneath, moving with the unhurried confidence of hunters who had never once doubted their own superiority over whatever prey waited for them. Well, one of them said, voice smooth and utterly without warmth, sweeping a gaze across the assembled group that lingered, for a moment too long, on Rias. A full peerage, whole and healthy, exactly as promised. The Gremry heiress herself, no less. This little detour is about to become considerably more profitable than we were led to expect. You're the ones who set up that ambush, Rias said, voice cold enough to match, using a compromised faction as bait. Bait is such an ugly word, the figure said, spreading gloved hands in mock apology. We prefer to think of it as an invitation. One you were rude enough to escape, thanks to whatever hid you inside this little pocket of nowhere. We've spent considerable effort finding you again. I'd rather not waste more of it on conversation. Then don't, Zenobia said, already moving, Durandal a blur of silver as she closed the distance before the words had fully left the harvester's mouth, and the fight that had been building since the moment they stepped off that first storm-ravaged beach finally, fully arrived. It was nothing like the Guardian's trial. The Guardian had pulled every blow, tested rather than truly threatened. The Harvesters held no such restraint, one of them meeting Zenovia's opening strike with a blade of dark, crackling energy that forced her back a full step, another already weaving through complex gestures that Aquino recognized, half a second too late, as a binding spell meant to lock the whole group's magic down at once. "Scatter!" Rias shouted, and the formation broke deliberately, each of them peeling into the wider, more chaotic movement real combat demanded, Aquino's lightning cutting the binding spell apart before it could fully form, Kaneko closing low and fast on the third harvester while Kiba moved to reinforce Zenovia's flank. Issei felt Drake's power surge hard at his wrist, the boosted gear practically humming with urgency. "Partner, these three are not like the Guardian. They intend actual harm. Do not hold back even slightly." "Wasn't planning to," Issei said again, the same words he'd used before the Guardian's fight, except this time they carried a very different weight, and he drove forward to add his boosted strength to Kaneko's flank the instant the third harvester's dark blade swept toward her unguarded side. The fight raged across the plateau in earnest now, the seven basins' golden light flaring brighter with every clash of power near them, as though responding directly to the danger, lending its glow to whatever strike happened to land closest. Asia's healing worked overtime, closing a shallow cut along Zenovia's forearm almost as fast as it opened, steadying Kiba's balance the instant a glancing blow nearly took his footing entirely. Irina's blessed blade caught one harvester's dark energy dead in its path, the resulting flash of holy light forcing the cloaked figure back with a hiss of genuine pain, the first real sign any of them had drawn actual blood, or whatever passed for it, from the enemy. It was Rias, finally, crimson power of destruction blazing at her fingertips, who drove the fight's turning point, catching the lead harvester in a direct exchange that ended with the cloaked figure staggering backward, its confident, mocking tone from earlier entirely gone. "Interesting," it said instead, breathing hard, studying the group with something colder and more calculating than the amusement it had worn stepping through the rift. Considerably more coordinated than the reports suggested. "I believe we underestimated exactly how thoroughly this little sanctuary has been shaping you." "Then leave," Rias said, power still crackling at her fingertips, chest heaving but her voice utterly steady. "While you still can." The harvester studied her for a long, tense moment, glancing toward its two companions, both of them bearing fresh marks from Kaneko's claws and Irina's blade respectively, before something in its posture shifted, calculation winning out over pride. "This round," it said, "belongs to you. But sanctuaries do not last forever, little heiress, and neither does whatever protection is currently bleeding itself dry to hold this barrier together. We will be waiting patiently for the day it finally gives out." The rift tore open behind them again, and the three cloaked figures stepped back through it without another word, the rupture ceiling shut behind them as quickly as it had opened, leaving the plateau in sudden, ringing silence, broken only by the group's own ragged breathing and the steady, quiet flare of the seven basins' golden light, still burning bright in the aftermath of a fight that had, against every reasonable expectation, ended in their favor. Nobody moved for a long moment after the rift sealed shut, the whole group standing scattered across the plateau in the loose, battered formation the fight had left them in, until finally Rias let the crimson power at her fingertips fade and turned to do the only thing that mattered more to her, in that instant, than the victory itself, a fast, careful count of every face present and accounted for. "Everyone," she said, voice tight with the aftermath of adrenaline. "Sound off." Now. They did, one after another, tired but whole, Zenovia's forearm fully healed thanks to Asia's tireless attention, Kiba's footing steady again, Kaneko favoring one arm slightly but insisting, with visible irritation at being fussed over, that it was nothing worth stopping for. Gasper, who had stayed close to Asia through the entire fight exactly as instructed, was shaking but unharmed, and the moment Rias finished her count and confirmed it, Asia knelt and pulled him into a proper hug, letting him shake it out against her shoulder without any judgment at all. "We held," Aquino said, still catching her breath, though there was fierce, exhausted pride threaded through her voice. "We actually held." "Barely," Zenovia said, though she was grinning despite the admission, wiping sweat from her brow with the back of one hand. That one with the dark blade was stronger than anything I've crossed swords with outside a raiding game. They'll be back, Rhea said, sobering the group quickly back down from the relief threatening to overtake them. They said as much themselves. This wasn't a defeat for them. It was reconnaissance. Then we use whatever time that buys us, Kiba said. Same as everything else this island's thrown at us. We get stronger, together, before they try again. Issei, still catching his own breath, found himself scanning the plateau instinctively for any sign of the warden's borrowed form, some part of him half expecting it to appear the way it always had at the end of a trial, and finding, instead, only the 7 basins burning steady in the gathering dark, and no golden light rising to explain itself. It hasn't come back, he said, the words landing heavier in the quiet plateau air than he'd intended. It said it'd be busy reinforcing the barrier, but that fight's over now. Shouldn't it have said something by now? The unease that rippled through the group at that was immediate and visible, Rias's expression tightening with fresh concern layered over the exhaustion of the fight they'd just survived. You're right. It should have. Maybe reinforcing the barrier takes longer than the fight did, Asia offered, though even she didn't sound entirely convinced by her own suggestion. Or maybe, Kaneko said quietly, voicing the thought none of the rest of them wanted to be the one to say first. Whatever it's doing down there cost more than it expected it to. Rias was already moving toward the stair before the sentence had fully finished, the exhaustion of the fight burning off instantly beneath fresh, sharp urgency. Then we go find out. Now. I am not leaving that debt unpaid after everything it's already given us. Nobody argued, the whole group falling into step behind her without hesitation, descending the long spiraling stair at a pace that left little breath for conversation, the golden glow lighting their way feeling, for the first time since they'd first climbed it, distinctly dimmer than Issei remembered, flickering in places it hadn't flickered before, as though whatever power sustained it was being drawn thin from somewhere deep below. They reached the vast chamber at the bottom to find the deep mirror's glow reduced to a faint, guttering shimmer across its surface, the massive stone guardian standing exactly where they'd left it, silent and unmoving, and at the chamber's center, kneeling on the pale stone with one hand pressed flat against the ground as though anchoring itself to the island by sheer will alone, the warden's borrowed form. Its blue eyes dimmed to barely visible points of light. Warden! Issei was moving before he'd consciously decided to, crossing the chamber at a dead run, the rest of the group close behind him, and the figure lifted its head slowly at their approach, the motion carrying visible effort it hadn't shown in any of their previous encounters. You held, it said, voice quieter than Issei had ever heard it, stripped of its usual layered resonance down to something almost fragile. I felt it, even from here. Your fight tipped the balance enough that I did not have to spend everything I had reinforcing the barrier alone. You bought yourselves, and me, more than you realize. You look terrible, Issei said bluntly, kneeling beside it, and the warden's mouth curved, faintly, into what might have been the ghost of amusement, an astute observation. Reinforcing centuries of failing magic in the space of a single skirmish carries a cost. I will recover. It will simply take time I did not expect to need quite so soon. Can we help? Asia asked immediately, already moving closer, her healing light gathering instinctively at her fingertips despite having no clear idea whether it would work on something like the warden at all. You already have, the warden said, more than you know. Rest here tonight, all of you. The barrier will hold until morning, I promise you that much certainly, and by then I hope to have recovered enough to tell you plainly what comes next, for I suspect, after tonight, that plainness is the very least you have earned from me. Rias knelt on its other side, studying its dimmed blue eyes with an expression that had shed every trace of the cool heiress composure she usually led with, replaced by something warmer, fiercer, unmistakably protective. We're not going anywhere, she said. Not until you're steady again. You didn't leave any of us to face that fight alone. We're not about to return the favor. The warden was quiet for a long moment, its dimmed eyes moving slowly across each of their faces gathered close around it in the vast, quiet chamber, before it spoke again, and though its voice remained faint, something in it had settled, warmed, found a kind of peace it hadn't carried since the moment it first introduced itself in the courtyard above. In all my centuries tending this island, it said, I do not believe I have ever once had a guest kneel beside me instead of waiting for me to rise and guide them onward. I find, rather unexpectedly, that I do not mind the reversal in the slightest. And there, in the dim, guttering light of the deep mirror, with the great stone guardian standing silent watch above them and the whole battered, unbroken family gathered close around the one guide who had carried them safely through everything the island had asked so far, they settled in to keep a different kind of watch than any they had kept before, waiting not for a trial to test them, but simply to make sure the one who had tested them so carefully would still be there, whole and steady. When morning finally came, morning arrived slowly in the deep chamber, no true dawn reaching this far beneath the island's surface. But the deep mirror's glow gradually strengthened through the night regardless, brightening by careful degrees until its familiar pulsing blue washed steadily across the chamber floor once more. Issei woke stiff from sleeping upright against cool stone, one arm gone entirely numb where Asia had fallen asleep against his shoulder some time past what felt like midnight, and blinked blearily around the chamber to find the warden's borrowed form already upright, kneeling no longer, its blue eyes burning brighter than they had the night before. "You're okay," he said, relief cutting through the last of his sleepiness at once. "Considerably improved," the warden confirmed, and this time when it spoke, the familiar layered resonance had returned in full, warm and steady rather than fragile. "I told you the barrier would hold until morning, and I meant it, though I confess I did not expect quite so many of you to insist on personally supervising my recovery through the entire night." "We weren't gonna just leave," Issei said, easing his numb arm free carefully enough not to wake Asia, though she stirred anyway, blinking up at him with sleepy confusion that cleared quickly once she registered the warden's improved condition. "You're better," she said, relief plain in her voice. "Thanks, in no small part, to a family willing to spend a night on cold stone rather than leave a guide to recover alone," the warden said. "I find I have very little practice being on the receiving end of that particular kindness. It is, I will admit, a pleasant thing to learn this late in my long existence." One by one, the rest of the group stirred awake around the chamber, Rias first among them, instantly alert the moment she registered the warden's restored strength, crossing the chamber quickly to confirm it for herself before allowing any of the tension in her shoulders to finally ease. "You said you'd tell us plainly what comes next," she said, once the whole group had gathered, bleary but attentive, around the chamber's center. "I'm holding you to that. And I intend to keep the promise," the warden said. "Sit, all of you, if you're willing. This will take longer to explain properly than a single breath allows." They settled into a loose circle around it, and the warden considered its words carefully before beginning, its blue eyes drifting once, briefly, toward the silent stone guardian still standing watch nearby. "The barrier held through the night, reinforced by both my effort and the strength you lent it during your fight. It will continue to hold, I believe, for a good while longer, weeks at minimum, possibly much longer if nothing forces it to bear another strain so soon. That buys you real time. Time to finish the trials properly, and time for me to recover fully from what last night cost." "And after that?" Zenobia asked. "After the trials are finished. What happens to us?" "To you? When the third and final trial of this tier is complete," the warden said, "the barrier will open a true path home, not the storm-ravaged tier that first brought you here, but a controlled passage, safe and precise, delivering you back to Ko within moments of the time you left it. Your world will barely have noticed your absence, though you yourselves will carry every bit of what this island has taught you." "And the harvesters?" Rias pressed. "They know we exist now. They know roughly where we came from. That doesn't just go away because we leave this island." "No," the warden agreed, and there was no attempt to soften the honesty of it. "It does not. They will continue hunting strays, and given how thoroughly you have already drawn their attention, I would be lying if I told you they will simply forget about you. But you will not face them as you would have before this island found you. You will face them as a family that has proven, again and again, that it does not break under pressure, and that is a very different thing to hunt than a peerage caught unaware in the middle of an ambush." Kiba was quiet for a moment, turning the information over carefully before speaking. "You mentioned, last night, that you built this place around proving strays weren't disposable. If we go home and the harvesters keep hunting people like us, does that mean this fight just continues somewhere else, without you there to help the next group who needs it?" "It does," the warden admitted. "I cannot follow you home, and I cannot personally intervene in every ambush across every corner of your world. What I can do is what I have always done. Watch for strays drawn too close to danger, and pull them somewhere safe when I am able. And perhaps, given what Rias offered me last night, something new as well. Rias sat up straighter at that, remembering exactly what she'd said in the moment. About not walking away and simply hoping you'll still be here. Precisely that, the warden said. It occurs to me, watching you these past days, that I have spent centuries treating this island as a solitary burden, mine alone to carry, mine alone to tend. I had not seriously considered, until you suggested it, that perhaps the strays who leave here whole might wish to remain connected to the place that helped them become whole in the first place, rather than simply vanishing back into your own lives and never looking back. You're saying you want us to stay in touch, Issei said, working through the layered phrasing to its simpler heart. I am saying, the warden said, something almost shy in its tone despite the ancient weight behind it, that I would very much welcome it, if you were willing. And that I would be glad, in turn, to reach out should I ever come across another stray family as worth protecting as this one has proven itself to be, should you wish to be more than merely former guests to whatever comes after you. Rias exchanged a long look around the circle of her peerage, gathering silent agreement from each face in turn before she answered for all of them. Then it settled. We're not just leaving this place behind once the last trial's done. Whatever this turns into, alliance, friendship, something in between, we're staying part of it. The warden's blue eyes brightened, just slightly, at that, something in its ancient bearing settling into a warmth it hadn't carried even during its most encouraging moments across the trials so far. Then let us finish what remains properly, it said, so that when the day comes to open that path home, you leave not merely as survivors of this island, but as its first true friends and longer than I care to admit. They spent the rest of that day recovering properly, the warden insisting, with unusual firmness, that no trial would open until the whole group had eaten, rested, and tended to whatever small injuries the fight against the harvesters had left behind. Asia moved methodically through the group with her healing light, closing the last lingering bruises Zenobia had been stubbornly ignoring, easing the ache still lingering in Kaniko's favored arm, and by early afternoon, the vast chamber had settled into an atmosphere closer to a genuine day of rest than anything the island had offered them since the very first quiet evening by the fire. Issei found himself, once the worst of the tending was done, wandering the chamber's edges with Kiba, the two of them drawn by simple restlessness into a loose, easy conversation that meandered without much direction until it settled, inevitably, on everything the warden had told them that morning. Feels strange, Kiba admitted, running a hand along one of the damaged wall carvings they'd passed on their way down days earlier. Knowing we're going home eventually. Actually going home. Part of me's gotten so used to this place that I almost forgot Ko was still out there waiting. Yeah, Issei said, considering it. I keep picturing what it's gonna be like walking back into school like nothing happened, when actually everything happened. Do you think it'll be strange? Being back? Probably. But I think that's okay. Issei leaned against the wall beside him, watching the deep mirror's steady glow pulse across the distant water. I think we're supposed to come back different. That's kind of the whole point of everything this place has put us through, right? Not just surviving it, but actually being changed by it. Kiba considered that for a long moment, something thoughtful settling over his usual easy expression. You've gotten a lot more reflective since the storm hit. Don't tell anyone. I've got a reputation to protect. That startled a genuine laugh out of Kiba, and the two of them fell into comfortable quiet after that, content simply to sit together and watch the chamber's slow, steady light, while the rest of the group scattered around them in their own smaller pockets of easy conversation. Near the deep mirror's edge, Rias had drawn Aquino into a quieter exchange, the two of them seated close together with their feet nearly brushing the water, watching its glow ripple gently outward from wherever they disturbed the surface. You've been different since the sacrifice trial, Rias observed. Lighter. I've noticed it, even if you haven't said much about it directly. I have been, Aquino admitted. I think I spent so long assuming my anger at my father was the only proof I had that what he did to my mother actually mattered, that letting go of even a little of it felt like letting go of her memory too. But it isn't. I don't think it ever was. I'm glad, Rias said simply, and reached over to squeeze her hand, the same easy, wordless affection the two of them had shared since long before the storm ever separated them. You deserve to carry less than you have been. So do you, Aquino said, turning the observation back around with the particular gentle directness she reserved only for Rias. You offered up the belief that keeping everyone safe was entirely your burden alone. I notice you've actually been letting the rest of us help more since. Issei especially. Rias's cheeks colored faintly at that, though she didn't deny it. He's earned the trust. All of them have. I think I forgot, somewhere along the way, that leading a peerage doesn't mean carrying every single weight myself. It means trusting the people I've chosen to carry pieces of it alongside me. Look at you, Aquino said, teasing warmth back in her voice now, sounding almost as wise as Issei's been lately. This island's changing all of us, I think. For the better, I hope. Definitely for the better, Aquino said, and the two of them settled back into comfortable quiet, watching the water's slow, steady pulse while the rest of their family rested easily around them, whole and healing and, for the first time since the storm first tore them from everything familiar, genuinely at peace with exactly where they'd ended up. The final trial of the second tier opened that evening, not with any dramatic announcement from the warden, but with a quiet, almost gentle shift in the chamber's light, the deep mirror's blue glow gradually giving way to a warmer gold that spread slowly across the water's surface until it illuminated a narrow path none of them had noticed before, leading toward a small, unassuming archway set into the chamber's far wall. That wasn't there this morning, Kaneko said, ears already tracking toward it with open curiosity. It opens only once the group is fully ready, body and heart both, the warden said, rising from where it had settled to rest through most of the day, its restored strength evident in the easy, fluid way it moved now, nothing like the fragile figure that had knelt exhausted at the chamber's center the night before. You are ready. I felt it the moment Aquino and Rias finished their conversation by the water. You were listening? Aquino asked, arching an eyebrow. I am this island, in every meaningful sense, the warden said, something almost apologetic in its tone. I hear a great deal I do not intend to eavesdrop upon. I promise I have never once used it against any of you. Fair enough, Rias said, already rising and dusting herself off, the rest of the group following suit with the easy readiness that had become second nature across their days on the island. What does this trial ask of us? Very little that requires explanation, the warden said, leading them toward the archway. You have already offered honesty, and proven trust, and fought together against a real and dangerous threat. This final trial asks only that you walk through together, as you are now, and let the island see, plainly and without any test dressed up around it, exactly what kind of family it has spent these past days helping to strengthen. That's it? Issei asked. Just walk through? Just that, the warden confirmed. Sometimes the truest measure of everything a group has built together is not found in another obstacle. It is found simply in how they choose to stand, side by side, once every obstacle has already been cleared. They approached the archway together, and Issei found Asia's hand finding his without either of them needing to reach for the gesture consciously anymore, the same easy, natural closeness that had settled between the whole group across every trial they'd faced, Rias falling into step at the center of them all, Aquino and Zenobia flanking close behind, Kiba and Irina trading a quiet, easy joke that dissolved into soft laughter even at the threshold of whatever waited beyond, Kaneko carrying Gasper on her back the last few steps when his own legs, tired from the long day, finally gave out beneath him. The archway's golden light swallowed them gently as they crossed through, warm rather than disorienting, and on the other side, Issei found himself blinking against the soft, familiar brightness, opening his eyes fully to discover they stood once more in the ruined courtyard where their journey on this island had first properly begun, the great statue rising tall and serene above them, its stone eyes no longer merely lit but fully open now. Warm gold light spilling from a gaze that seemed for the first time, genuinely alive. The 7 alcoves ringing its base, empty since the very first morning, no longer stood bare. Each one held, instead, a single small flame, identical to the ones they had kindled on the plateau, burning steady and unwavering, and above them, carved into the statue's base in script that Issei somehow found he could read now, though he hadn't been able to before, ran a line of words that settled over the whole group in a hush of quiet, shared understanding. Family proven is family kept. The second tier is complete, the warden said, its voice rising warm and full from the statue itself now, layered and resonant, and unmistakably proud. You have walked every trial this island could offer, faced fear and fatigue and real danger both, and emerged not merely intact, but stronger, closer, more thoroughly yourselves than when you first arrived. There remains only the final passage now, the true path home, and I promise you, when the time comes to walk it, you will do so as guests this island will remember, gladly, for as long as I remain here to remember anything at all. Rias looked around at her assembled family, at Issei's steady presence beside Asia, at Akino's easy warmth, at Zenovia's fierce readiness, at Kiba's quiet strength, at Irina's bright faith, at Kaniko's watchful loyalty with Gasper resting safely against her back, and felt, in the settling gold light of the courtyard where this entire impossible journey had begun, a certainty she hadn't carried since long before the storm first tore them from everything familiar. Whatever waited for them beyond the final passage, whatever the harvesters still had planned, whatever challenges Ko and the wider world still held in store, she would face all of it exactly the way this island had taught her to, not as a king carrying every burden alone, but as one voice among a family that had proven, beyond any doubt, that it knew how to carry every single piece of the weight together. They lingered in the courtyard long after the warden's voice had faded back into the statue's quiet golden glow, nobody quite ready yet to treat the moment as finished, and Rias, watching her peerage scatter loosely across the familiar ruined space where this entire journey had begun, found she didn't want to rush them toward whatever came next either. There would be time enough for the final passage. Tonight belonged to something quieter. Zenobia ended up seated near the base of the great statue, running her fingers absently along the carved script at its base, when Irina settled beside her with 2 handfuls of the pale, glowing flowers gathered from around the courtyard's edge. I've been thinking about what you offered up, Irina said, working a few of the flowers into a loose braid without quite looking at Zenobia directly. About faith not needing to look like anyone else's to count. I don't think I ever meant to make you feel like yours was smaller. I know you didn't, Zenobia said. That's rather the point of a fear, though. It doesn't need someone to actually cause it. It just needs a little space to grow in on its own. Well, Irina said, holding up the finished braid and setting it, with careful ceremony, into Zenovia's hair, for what it's worth, I think your faith is the fiercest thing about you, and I've always meant that as the highest compliment I know how to give. Zenovia's cheeks colored, faint but unmistakable, and she reached up to touch the braid with something unusually gentle for her usual blunt demeanor. That's the nicest thing you've said to me in longer than I can remember. Don't get used to it, Irina said, grinning, the teasing warmth restoring some familiar ease between them. I've got a reputation for cheerful nonsense to maintain. A short distance away, Kaniko had settled with Gasper finally sound asleep against her side once more, and Issei, drifting past on his own slow circuit of the courtyard, dropped down beside her without needing an invitation, the easy comfort between them long since past requiring one. You've been quieter than usual tonight, he said. Thinking, Kaniko said. About going home. About what it's gonna be like, after everything. Good thinking or bad thinking? Good, I think. Mostly. She glanced down at Gasper's sleeping face, something soft passing briefly over her usual guarded expression. I used to think being close to people just meant more chances to lose them eventually. This place kind of proved that wrong. Or at least proved it doesn't have to stop me from getting close anyway. That's a pretty big shift for you. Yeah, well. She allowed herself a small, rare smile. Guess this island's good for that kind of thing. Across the courtyard, Kiba had wandered near the arch where Kaniko had first found it days earlier, tracing the same worn carvings with a thoughtful expression, and Asia, catching sight of him alone, crossed to join him with the quiet, easy warmth she extended to everyone in the family without exception. You all right? She asked. Better than all right, Kiba said, and meant it, something settled and at peace in his voice that hadn't been there even a few days earlier. Just thinking about how strange it is, that the place that made me finally let go of some old guilt is a carved archway in the middle of a jungle none of us had ever heard of a week ago. I don't think it matters much where healing happens, Asia said gently. Only that it does. Wise as ever. I had a good teacher, she said, glancing pointedly toward where Issei still sat with Kaneko, and Kiba laughed, soft and genuine, the sound carrying easily across the quiet courtyard. It was Akino, eventually, who gathered enough of the pale flowers to weave a full garland, draping it with easy ceremony over the head of the great statue itself while the rest of the group watched, amused and touched in equal measure. What was that for? Rias asked, coming to stand beside her. A thank you, Akino said simply, stepping back to admire the effect, the pale flowers glowing softly against the statue's weathered stone. It's not much. But I imagine whoever built this place would appreciate knowing it's still capable of being beautiful, not just tested and survived. Rias considered the garland for a long moment, something warm settling behind her eyes. You're right. It should be beautiful. It has been, this whole time, really. We were just too busy being scared to notice most of it. Well, Akino said, looping her arm easily through Rias's, we're noticing now. They stood together like that for a while, watching the rest of their family settle into their own small, quiet corners of the courtyard, firelight and golden statue light mingling warmly across faces that had, in the space of a single strange, difficult, remarkable week, become something more thoroughly bonded than months of ordinary life back in Co had ever quite managed to make them. Issei found himself, eventually, drawn back toward Rias's side, the two of them settling near the courtyard's edge with the whole family scattered comfortably around them, and for a long while either of them said anything at all, content simply to sit together beneath the strange, familiar stars and let the quiet of a hard-won peace settle fully over them both. Thank you, Rias said finally, breaking the silence. For what? For never once, through any of this, making it harder than it needed to be. For being exactly the kind of person worth building a family around. Issei felt his face warm, and found, for once, that he didn't have a joke ready to deflect it with, only the simple, honest truth sitting steady in his chest. Right back at you, Bucho. Every bit of it. She smiled at that, soft and unguarded, and leaned her head against his shoulder the way Asia had done that very first night by the fire, and the courtyard settled into an easy, contented quiet, 8 teenagers and 1 small vampire boy, whole and healing and thoroughly, unmistakably ready for whatever waited on the other side of the final passage home. It was well past what passed for midnight when the golden light around the great statue's eyes flickered, just once, subtly enough that Issei might have missed it entirely if he hadn't already been watching the statue out of restless habit, unable to fully settle into sleep despite the day's exhaustion. He sat up slowly, careful not to disturb Asia, who had finally drifted off against his shoulder sometime in the last hour, and studied the flicker with a growing, uneasy attention. It happened again. Longer this time, the warm gold dimming almost to nothing before steadying back to its usual glow. Warden? He said quietly, not wanting to wake the others yet if it turned out to be nothing. The response came slower than usual, and when the layered voice finally rose from the statue, it carried an edge Issei hadn't heard in it before, not the exhaustion of the night after the harvester fight, but something sharper, more alert. You should not be awake to notice that, the warden said. Forgive me. I did not intend for it to be visible. Visible or not, I noticed. What was that? A pause, longer than the warden usually allowed itself. The barrier is testing itself against something at its farthest edge. Not an attack, not yet. More a probe, careful and patient, the kind a hunter sends ahead of itself to learn the shape of what it's about to face before committing fully. Issei's stomach dropped. The harvesters. They're already back. Not the same 3 who tested you on the plateau, the warden said. Something larger. I cannot yet tell you how large, only that it is deliberate, and patient, and considerably more careful than the scouting party you already turned away. By now the quiet murmur of their conversation had woken Rias, who sat up instantly alert, followed quickly by the rest of the group stirring in the courtyard around them, drawn by the same tension Issei had felt prickling at the edges of the night air. What's happening? Rias said, already on her feet. Something's testing the barrier, Issei told her. Bigger than the group from the plateau. The warden's voice rose again, steadier now, though the sharp edge of alertness remained clear beneath it. I do not believe it will breach tonight. Whatever probes the edge of my barrier now is gathering information, not launching an assault. But I would be doing you a disservice if I told you this changes nothing about the timeline I gave you this morning. The harvesters, it seems, are more determined than even I anticipated, and I suspect the scouting party you turned away reported back with rather more urgency than mere professional pride would explain. So what do we do? Zenobia asked, already reaching for Durandal out of pure reflex despite the warden's assurance that no attack was imminent. Tonight you rest, as much as the news allows, the warden said. Tomorrow, we open the final passage sooner than I had originally planned, not because the trials are incomplete, for they are not, but because I would rather see you safely return to a world where your own strength can operate freely, than keep you here as a target for whatever this larger presence intends, however well protected this island remains. Rias's jaw set, the familiar steel returning to her expression even through the fresh unease. You're saying it's not safe here anymore either. I am saying, the warden corrected gently, that nowhere is ever entirely safe once something as patient as the harvesters has decided you are worth this much effort. But you leave this island tomorrow considerably stronger than the group that first washed up on that beach, and I intend to make certain you leave it with every advantage I am still able to offer, up to and including whatever I can determine about what exactly is testing my barrier tonight. The courtyard settled into tense, wakeful quiet after that, nobody quite willing to return fully to sleep despite the warden's reassurance that no immediate attack was coming, the whole family instead gathering closer together near the great statue's base, Asia's hand finding Issei's again without either of them needing to reach for the gesture consciously, Ria standing a careful watch near the courtyard's edge with Zenobia close beside her, both of them scanning a treeline that gave away. Nothing at all of whatever patient, careful presence waited somewhere beyond the barrier's furthest reach. One more trial, Kaneko said quietly, into the tense hush, Gasper stirring awake beside her at the sound of her voice. Feels like there's always one more. Maybe, Issei said, watching the great statue's eyes settle back into their steady, unbroken gold, no further flicker disturbing the warm light. But we've gotten pretty good at those lately. Kaneko managed a small, tired smile at that, and the family settled in together to wait out the remaining hours of a night that had, in the space of a single flickering light, shifted from quiet, hard-won peace into something sharper, more uncertain, the promise of home now tangled inseparably with the promise of whatever patient, hungry thing had just begun testing the very edges of the sanctuary that had kept them safe.